My name is Leslie Rogers. I am 32 years old, a logistics manager at an aviation plant in Kansas, and exactly 2 weeks before Christmas, my mother called to uninvite me from our family dinner. Her exact words were that it was a family event and my presence would embarrass my brother. I told myself it was fine, that I had enough inventory reports to keep me busy through the holidays anyway. But when my brother and his mountain of debt hit the local evening news on Christmas Eve, I realized that being erased from the family portrait was the greatest gift my parents could have ever given me. If you have ever been treated like an unwanted guest by your own blood, keep listening. Welcome to the Intimately Told Stories channel. Drop your age in the comments and tell me what you would have done in my shoes. Now let me take you back to the afternoon the illusion shattered. December in Wichita usually carried a bitter wind that swept off the Great Plains, stripping the final dead leaves from the oak trees. Not this year. The air sat heavy and thick, hovering near 70 degrees. It felt unnatural, a false spring resting over the city like a cheap coat of paint masking dry rot. I stood on the steel catwalk overlooking the main assembly floor of the plant. Beneath my work boots, the facility hummed with calculated chaos. Sparks rained from the welding bays in brilliant blue arcs. The sharp tang of ozone and heavy machine oil coated the back of my throat. It was a world governed by supply chains' precision and reliable returns. It was the exact opposite of the life my family preferred. My phone vibrated against my hip, buzzing through the thick fabric of my safety trousers. I pulled the device out, shielding the screen from the harsh overhead fluorescence. The caller ID read, Mom. I stepped back into the glass-paneled observation corridor, pulling the heavy steel door shut behind me. The roar of the factory muffled into a persistent low-frequency thud. I tapped the green icon, expecting the usual seasonal demands. A request to pick up a specific brand of imported cider, or perhaps an order to arrive early and set the dining table so my brother could relax. Hey, Mom, I'm on shift. What do you need? Leslie. Her voice carried no warmth. It held the rigid, polished tone she usually reserved for country club disputes and returning defective merchandise. I am calling about the 24th. I already took the paid time off, I said, leaning my shoulder against the cool glass. I will drive up by noon. Do not bother. I blinked. A forklift beeped in reverse somewhere on the floor below, the sound faint through the glass. Do not drive up by noon. When do you want me there? I do not want you there at all. She let out a sharp sigh, conveying a practiced, theatrical exhaustion. It is a family event, Leslie. Travis is bringing some key investors from his new agricultural energy firm. People who matter. We need the right atmosphere. The words landed flat. They held zero emotion, which somehow made the cut run deeper. I stared through the glass at a riveter driving steel bolts into an aluminum fuselage. I am your daughter, I said, my voice dropping a fraction. It is Christmas Eve. And you embarrass your brother, she replied without missing a single beat. You ask tedious questions. You lack vision. Travis is on the verge of a public expansion, and your pragmatism is exhausting. We need a supportive environment, not an interrogation about his profit margins and logistics. Travis. Every road always led back to the 30-year-old prodigy. While I spent my 20s earning a degree and climbing the ranks of the supply chain on night shifts, Travis chased phantom wealth in the green energy sector, wearing designer suits paid for by our parents. So I am uninvited to Christmas because I do not applaud loud enough. Do not play the victim, she snapped, the polished veneer cracking just an inch. We will send you a gift card. Just stay in Wichita. Let your brother have his moment. The line went dead. No goodbye. No hesitation. I pulled the phone away from my ear. The screen faded to black, reflecting my own tired eyes. I stood alone in the narrow corridor. Through the glass, a heavy hydraulic press drove downward, shaping raw metal through sheer, unyielding force. The contrast hit me squarely in the chest. Behind me stood an industry defined by thunderous, undeniable reality. In my hand rested a dead piece of plastic, delivering an eerie, hollow silence. I did not cry. The sting was not a sudden injury. It was the final snap of a frayed rope. They were not just rearranging the seating chart to favor the golden boy. They were actively editing me out of the picture. I was an inconvenience, an unsightly blemish on the curated image of the Rogers family. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, turned my back on the glass, and walked toward the factory floor. The false spring outside would inevitably freeze, but for now, I had a schedule to keep. Returning to my desk required passing through the quality control sector. Rows of inspectors stood under harsh halogen lights, running precision micrometers over titanium turbine blades. In this building, a millimeter of deviation meant a grounded fleet. Reality was measurable. It was rigid. You could not talk a micrometer into ignoring a flaw. I swiped my security badge, pushed through the heavy double doors into the administrative wing, and welcomed the sudden quiet. My office was a modest square of gray carpet and sound-dampening fabric, dominated by 2 large monitors. I dropped into my ergonomic chair and rolled my shoulders to release the tension gathering near my neck. A stack of vendor manifests waited for my approval, requiring cross-referencing against state tax registries and safety compliance logs. Before diving into the numbers, I pulled up a fresh browser window and navigated to my social media feed. It took less than 3 swipes of the mouse wheel to find him. Travis. There he was, grinning into the camera lens from a sprawling field of dormant winter wheat. He wore a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, the fabric far too pristine for a man claiming to work in the dirt. Behind him sat a gleaming combine harvester. The paint was spotless, the heavy treads free of any recognizable field mud. The caption beneath the photo read, "Closing another groundbreaking quarter for Apex Horizon Energy, revolutionizing the Great Plains. Big moves ahead." The post boasted hundreds of likes. Prominent at the top of the comment section was a heart icon left by our mother, Diane. Her text read, "So proud of our visionary." I stared at that single word, visionary. It was the designated shield they used to deflect any practical questions about his endless string of unverified achievements. The dynamic was not born overnight. It was an institution built brick by brick over decades. My mind drifted back to a crisp November morning 14 years ago. Travis was turning 18. Our father, Martin, had blindfolded him and led him into the driveway. When the blindfold slipped off, my brother stood before a silver pickup truck, fresh off the dealership lot, with a temporary tag still taped in the window. Travis had no job, poor high school grades, and 0 prospects. Yet Martin tossed him the keys with a proud slap on the shoulder, declaring that a man needed to look the part to get ahead in this world. 6 months after that driveway celebration, I sat at the kitchen table, sliding a modest tuition bill for my first semester at the State University across the granite counter. Diane glanced at the printed total, let out a soft sigh, and slid the paper right back to me. "You have always been so resourceful, Leslie," she had said, offering a tight smile. "We are stretched tight helping your brother launch his consulting phase. You will figure it out." I figured it out by working overnight inventory shifts at a regional hardware store. I breathed in drywall dust and stacked heavy boxes of industrial fasteners until my hands blistered and cracked. I paid for my own textbooks, my own rent, my own fuel. Meanwhile, Travis cycled through an endless parade of lucrative phases. The consulting phase faded into the real estate phase, which eventually morphed into a tech startup phase. Each endeavor required seed money. My parents opened their checkbooks without a second thought, financing downtown lofts, tailored wardrobes, and premium business cards to ensure he projected an aura of inevitable success. Now it was the green agricultural energy phase. I looked back at the photograph on my monitor. Something about the pristine combine harvester snagged my logistical instincts. I managed supply chains for an aviation behemoth. My daily routine involved vetting corporate entities, running tax identification numbers, and tracing shell corporations to ensure our suppliers were legitimate operations. I knew exactly what a functioning, profitable industrial footprint looked like. It left a tangible paper trail. I opened a secure terminal on my left monitor. It was a comprehensive commercial registry database, a specialized tool reserved for deep background checks on potential contractors. My fingers moved across the keyboard out of sheer, unadulterated curiosity. I typed in the name: Apex Horizon Energy. The search algorithm churned for a fraction of a second before returning the results. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes scanning the data blocks. I expected to find a modest operation, perhaps a limited liability company with a handful of leased assets. There were no industrial equipment leases registered under that corporate name anywhere in the state of Kansas. There were no heavy machinery transport permits filed with the Department of Transportation. I expanded the search to include commercial real estate holdings. Blank. The official business address listed on the state charter was a residential property. Specifically, it was the suburban townhouse Travis currently rented. There were no active vendor contracts, no payroll tax records indicating a functioning staff, and no history of state-level utility partnerships. The company was a ghost. It was a hollow shell constructed out of digital buzzwords and rented props. He likely leased that combine harvester by the hour just to snap a photograph for his social media followers. It was the exact same charade he had been playing since he was a teenager, only now the stage was larger. He was faking an entire corporate enterprise to impress people who did not matter, funded by parents who refused to see the truth. A laser printer sat at the edge of my desk. I hit a keyboard shortcut, routing the bleak, empty audit report to the tray. The machine hummed to life, pulling crisp white paper through its rollers. I picked up the warm sheets, reading over the empty columns where revenue, assets, and liabilities should have been listed. It was undeniable proof of his fiction. A part of me wanted to scan the document, attach it to an email, and send it directly to my mother. I wanted to force them to look at the cold, hard numbers. But I knew exactly how that conversation would unfold. Diane would accuse me of jealousy. She would call me bitter. She would claim I lacked the entrepreneurial spirit to understand how modern wealth was built. Martin would shake his head and tell me I was being too hard on my brother. They would rally around him, framing my pragmatism as a direct attack on his fragile dreams. I folded the audit report precisely in half. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the one that required a physical key, and placed the document inside a thick manila folder. I slid the drawer shut and turned the lock, pocketing the small brass key. I chose silence. I convinced myself it was just another iteration of his endless ego. Travis inflating his self-worth to attract naive angel investors or to impress his country club friends was not my problem. Let him pretend to be a mogul, and let my parents pretend to be the proud architects of his success. I had real cargo to move, and real spreadsheets to balance. I closed the browser tabs and turned my attention back to the aviation manifests. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of incoming shipments, routing numbers, and inventory reconciliations. By the time I finally clocked out, the false spring sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the sprawling Kansas plains. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. I lived in a practical, unassuming complex on the outskirts of the city, far removed from the trendy neighborhoods my brother frequented. The evening air felt stagnant, carrying the scent of dry earth and imminent weather. I climbed the 2 flights of stairs to my floor, jingling my keys in my hand. My mind was already transitioning to my evening routine, a simple dinner, an hour of reading, and sleep. The rejection from the family Christmas dinner still pulsed like a dull ache, but I resolved to pack it away. I would enjoy a quiet holiday, free from the exhaustion of pretending to admire a phantom empire. I reached my door and unlocked it, pushing it open with my shoulder. I bent down to retrieve the mail scattered across the entryway floor. Most of it was junk. Grocery store circulars, a coupon for oil changes, a generic holiday card from my dentist. But one envelope felt different. It was thick, crisp, and bore the austere logo of a major national credit bureau. Across the front, stamped in bold red ink, were words that made my blood run cold. Priority Security Alert. I dropped my keys on the counter. My thumb tore through the paper seal. The silence I had chosen hours earlier was about to become a luxury I could no longer afford. I stood in my narrow entryway, staring at the single sheet of thick paper. The bold red ink at the top of the page seemed to bleed into the crisp white background. Priority Security Alert. Below the imposing header, a dense block of text detailed an automated fraud prevention notice. A commercial underwriting firm had just flagged an unusually large credit inquiry tied directly to my Social Security number. I ran my thumb over the printed numbers, feeling the raised ink against my skin. $850,000. The asset class was listed as heavy agricultural machinery and rural infrastructure development. The primary corporate applicant was Apex Horizon Energy. The secondary guarantor was Leslie Rogers. My breathing shallowed. A tight, unyielding band clamped around my chest, restricting the air in my lungs. This was not a past due notice from a forgotten utility bill. It was not a collection attempt. It was an active, pending financial application. Someone had submitted my pristine financial portfolio to backstop a commercial loan large enough to buy a small neighborhood. The inquiry was currently sitting in the final stage of underwriting approval, waiting for a concluding digital signature or an automated verification clear. I walked to my kitchen island, dropping my keys onto the cold granite surface. The metallic clatter echoed sharply through the quiet apartment. I leaned forward, resting my weight on my palms, forcing myself to inhale deeply. My mind shifted into the logistical framework I used on the factory floor. I needed to isolate the variables. I needed to understand the point of failure. How did they bypass the authorization protocols? The answer surfaced almost instantly, a buried memory from my freshman year of college breaking through the static. Before I secured my overnight hardware store job, my father insisted on opening a linked family checking account at a local credit union. He handed me the paperwork on a Sunday afternoon, telling me to sign on the bottom line. He claimed it was a safety net, a way for them to wire funds instantly if my car broke down or my rent fell short. They never deposited a single dime into that account. I maintained it, built my early credit history through it, and eventually shifted my primary banking to an independent institution. But the original account remained open, tethered to Martin and Diane as co-signers. They still possessed the routing data, the historic authorization privileges, and the digital backdoor to my identity. They were attempting to leverage 14 years of my immaculate financial discipline to finance Travis and his hollow empire. My phone sat on the counter, its screen dark and silent. I could call Diane right now. I could demand an immediate explanation. I pictured the conversation playing out in real time. She would use a soothing, patronizing tone. She would claim it was a mere formality, a temporary bridge loan to get Travis through a minor cash flow hurdle until his investors finalized their paperwork. Martin would jump on the line next, appealing to my sense of duty, insisting that family protects family. They would stall. They would manipulate the narrative and play on my guilt until the underwriting process finalized, leaving me legally tethered to a sinking ship. I checked the timestamp printed near the bottom of the alert. The inquiry had been initiated 48 hours ago. Commercial loans of this scale required an extensive risk review period, typically lasting 3 to 5 business days. The clock was running out. I had a rapidly closing window to amputate the connection before the debt became a permanent, inescapable anchor around my neck. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my dining table under the harsh glow of the overhead pendant light, drinking bitter, black coffee and gathering every financial document, tax return, and banking statement I possessed. I needed a professional. Not a family mediator, but a specialist in corporate severances and risk mitigation. At 7 a.m, I called my direct supervisor at the aviation plant. I told Garrett I had a sudden legal emergency and needed to burn a half day of paid time off. He did not ask prying questions. He only told me to handle my business, protect my assets, and return to the floor when my head was clear. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting in a polished mahogany chair inside a pristine downtown Wichita law firm. Elliot Cole sat across from me. He was a meticulous man in his late 50s, wearing a sharp gray suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He did not traffic in emotion or family drama. He traded in contracts, liabilities, and the cold reality of the law. I slid the credit bureau alert across his broad desk, followed immediately by my printed audit of Apex Horizon Energy from the previous afternoon. Elliot adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents with trained precision. His expression remained neutral, but the slight tightening of his jaw signaled his understanding of the danger. He placed the papers down and folded his hands over his desk. "Your brother operates a phantom enterprise," Elliot said, tapping his index finger against the audit report. "There is zero collateral here. No real estate, no equipment, no liquid capital. If this underwriter approves the funding, they are basing the entire risk profile on your Tier 1 credit score and your steady corporate income. You are the only real asset in this equation. How do we stop it?" I asked, my voice remaining remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "We do not just stop it," Elliot replied, reaching for a yellow legal pad. "We scorch the earth around your identity. If we merely flag the inquiry, your parents can simply try another lender next week. We need to enact an airtight financial severance." He outlined the defensive strategy with surgical precision. First, we would execute a hard security freeze on all 3 major credit bureaus, locking my profile away from any external inquiries. Next, he would draft a formal cease and desist order directed at Apex Horizon Energy, explicitly prohibiting the use of my personal identifying information. The most crucial step involved terminating the linked family account entirely. Elliot would file an identity misuse affidavit, a binding legal declaration stating that any signature, digital or physical, attached to the commercial loan was unauthorized and fraudulent. "Will this trigger a criminal investigation into my parents?" I asked, my grip tightening on the armrests of the chair. Elliot looked up from his notepad, his gaze piercing. "The affidavit serves as a defensive shield. It informs the underwriter that the guarantor is invalid. The bank will instantly reject the loan to protect their own capital. Whether the lender decides to pursue your brother and your parents for attempted fraud depends entirely on their internal corporate policies. Your priority is survival, not their protection." I looked out the large window of his office. The false spring sunshine illuminated the bustling city streets below, casting bright reflections off the passing cars. For 32 years, I had navigated my existence by avoiding conflict. I had shrunk myself to make room for my brother and his inflated ego. I had paid my own way, maintained the peace, and accepted my role as the invisible daughter. Their decision to uninvite me from the Christmas dinner was a social slight. Their attempt to secretly chain me to an $850,000 ghost debt was an act of profound hostility. "Draft the affidavit," I said, turning my gaze back to the attorney. "Freeze the credit, sever the accounts, do whatever it takes to build a wall they cannot climb." Elliot nodded his pen, scratching rapidly across the paper. "It will take me 2 hours to prepare the formal filings. Once you sign these documents, there is no unwinding the process. The rejection of this loan will be swift, and the resulting fallout will land directly on your brother. Are you prepared to face that reaction?" "They told me I was not part of the family event," I replied, keeping my posture rigid and my tone icy. "I am simply making their statement legally binding." The next 2 hours passed in a tense blur of dense legal terminology and notarized signatures. I signed my name a dozen times, each stroke of the pen feeling like a heavy iron chain snapping loose from my wrists. I watched Elliot scan the final documents into his encrypted database, firing off the credit freezes and the official rejection notices directly to the underwriting firm. When I finally walked out of the law firm and stepped onto the Kansas pavement, the heavy, unnatural warmth of the December morning hit my face. My financial identity was now an impenetrable fortress. The authorization was dead. Travis would not get his funding, and the house of cards he had spent years building was one strong gust of wind away from a total collapse. I unlocked my car, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The immediate danger was neutralized, but the nervous energy refused to fade. I had cut the fuse, but the bomb was still sitting in my parents' living room. Eventually, the bank would notify Travis that his golden ticket had been revoked. He would realize his invisible, pragmatic sister had just dismantled his entire scheme with a few strokes of a pen. I started the engine, pulling out into the dense downtown traffic. My phone sat in the passenger seat, silent and dark. The blast wave was coming, and I needed to brace for the impact. I pointed my car back toward the aviation plant. I needed the roar of the factory floor. I needed the undeniable reality of steel schedules and logistics to drown out the impending chaos. The 2 days following my visit to the attorney felt like walking across a frozen lake, waiting for the ice to crack beneath my boots. I had severed the financial tether frozen my credit and launched a formal affidavit rejecting the loan. Now, the outcome was entirely out of my hands. I was just waiting for the underwriter to process the rejection and notify my brother that his staggering financial lifeline had been terminated. To cope with the waiting, I buried myself in the only place that offered predictable structure: the aviation plant. It was the evening of December 22nd. The administrative wing was nearly hollow. Most of the corporate staff had already departed for the holiday shutdown, trading their cubicles for packed suitcases and crowded airport terminals. The sweeping overhead lights had automatically dimmed to half capacity, casting long, sharp shadows across the rows of empty desks. Down on the assembly floor, a skeleton crew maintained the essential machinery, leaving the usual thunderous roar reduced to a steady, rhythmic hum. I sat at my workstation, surrounded by stacks of year-end compliance reports. My dual monitors cast a pale blue glow over my face. I was auditing freight manifests, a tedious process that required matching incoming titanium shipments against our internal vendor database. It was dry, repetitive work. It was exactly what I needed to keep my mind away from my phone, which sat dark and silent on the edge of my desk. My parents had not called. Travis had not texted. The silence felt heavy, charged with invisible tension. Footsteps broke the quiet. Slow, deliberate strides moved across the carpeted aisle. I looked up and saw Garrett approaching. Garrett was the director of supply chain operations, a veteran of the aerospace industry who had spent 30 years optimizing global freight routes. He was a practical, weathered man who valued precision above all else. He wore a simple button-down shirt, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, carrying a thin red folder in his right hand. "I thought I was the only one hiding from the holidays," Garrett said, leaning against the fabric partition of my cubicle. "Just finishing up the fourth quarter compliance audits," I replied, shifting my keyboard aside. "I prefer the quiet. It makes the numbers easier to read." Garrett did not smile. His expression remained professional, but there was a tightness around his eyes. He tossed the red folder onto the center of my desk. "I need your eyes on this," he said, his voice dropping to a serious register. The automated system flagged a routing anomaly in our secondary logistics network. A third-tier freight brokerage just submitted an invoice for a shipment of hydraulic fluid. The fluid arrived on schedule, but the billing entity failed our internal background verification. I opened the folder. Inside sat a standard commercial invoice printed on crisp white paper. My eyes scanned the black text, searching for the discrepancy. The billing company was listed as Great Plains Synergy. It was a generic, unassuming corporate title, the kind of name designed to blend into a spreadsheet without drawing attention. I checked the state tax identification number. It was valid. I checked the routing digits. They were standard. Then my eyes drifted down to the registered corporate address. My breath caught in my throat. The air in the quiet office suddenly felt thin. The address printed on the invoice was a residential property. It was the exact same suburban townhouse Travis currently rented. It was the same address tied to his phantom green energy empire. A cold wave of dread washed over my skin. My brother was not just faking an agricultural startup to impress his country club friends. He was actively spinning up multiple shell corporations attempting to broker fractional freight contracts with my employer. He was trying to infiltrate the supply chain of a global aviation manufacturer, leveraging my corporate association to lend his fake entities a shred of credibility. The invisible wall separating my personal nightmare from my professional reality had just collapsed. His mess was bleeding into my career. Garrett watched my face intently. "You recognize the address," he stated. It was not a question. I kept my hands flat on the desk, willing them not to tremble. In this industry, a conflict of interest could end a career overnight. If Garrett thought I was secretly funneling corporate capital to my brother, my security clearance would be revoked before sunrise. "It is my brother," I said, my voice tight but steady. "I need you to understand, Garrett. I had zero knowledge of this invoice. I did not approve this vendor. I did not route this shipment. My brother is currently operating several fraudulent entities, and I spent my entire morning 2 days ago at a law firm legally severing all my ties to his identity." Garrett did not interrupt. He stood perfectly still, letting my words hang in the dim office. "He is trying to use my position here to validate his shell companies," I continued, forcing myself to maintain direct eye contact. "I want this vendor flagged. I want Great Plains Synergy blacklisted from our procurement network permanently. Furthermore, I will submit a formal declaration of non-involvement to the Human Resources Department first thing tomorrow morning." Garrett reached down and tapped the red folder with his index finger. The tension in his shoulders visibly softened. "I already ran the approval history," he said quietly. "I know you did not sign off on this, Leslie. Your digital footprint is clean. The invoice bypassed your desk through an automated overflow channel. I brought it to you because I noticed the surname match on the corporate registry and figured you needed to know your blind spots." I let out a slow, shaky breath. The immediate threat to my job dissolved, but the underlying horror remained. Travis was spiraling. He was grasping at every possible revenue stream, submitting fake invoices to major corporations and hoping slipping through the cracks would generate enough cash to keep his illusion alive. He was a drowning man, trying to pull everyone else under the water with him. Garrett pulled up a chair and sat down across from me. He folded his hands in his lap, looking out toward the dark windows of the administrative wing. "You know I have not spoken to my father in 11 years, Garrett said. The sudden personal admission caught me off guard. Garrett was notoriously private. He never kept family photographs on his desk and never participated in the usual Monday morning chatter about weekend gatherings. I looked at him, waiting for the rest of the thoughts. My father was a charismatic man. Garrett continued, his voice steady and reflective. He was the kind of guy who could charm a room and talk his way out of any consequence. But he viewed family as a bank account he never had to deposit into. He drained my mother. He drained my older sister. When he finally came for my savings, I changed my phone number and moved across the country. Garrett turned his gaze back to me, his eyes sharp and understanding. People like that do not change, Leslie. They just find new ways to extract what they want. Blood is a biological fact. It is not a moral obligation to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. You are doing the right thing. Lock the doors. Protect your assets. Let him face his own consequences. Thank you, I whispered. The validation felt like a heavy weight lifting from my chest. For 2 weeks, I had carried the guilt of my mother uninviting me, wondering if my pragmatism truly was the problem. Hearing Garrett speak the truth out loud confirmed what I already knew. I was not the villain. I was the target. Garrett stood up, retrieving the red folder from my desk. I will handle the blacklisting for this vendor. Go home, Leslie. The plant will survive without you for a few days. Turn your phone off and get some rest. He walked away, his footsteps fading into the quiet hum of the building. I sat alone at my desk for another hour, finalizing my logistics reports. The panic had subsided, replaced by a profound, unyielding clarity. My parents wanted a curated family event without my embarrassing presence. I was going to grant their wish entirely. I pulled up a map on my monitor and searched for diners outside the city limits. I found a small, independent truck stop on Highway 40, miles away from the suburban pretense of Wichita. It sat on the edge of the open prairie, serving strong coffee and pie to night shift drivers and solitary travelers. That was where I would spend my Christmas Eve. I would sit in a vinyl booth, surrounded by strangers, and embrace the peace of my own company. I shut down my computer, grabbed my coat, and walked out into the cool Kansas night. The false spring was finally beginning to break. A sharp chill had entered the wind, carrying the distinct scent of impending snow. The storm was gathering. I unlocked my car and tossed my bag onto the passenger seat. As the engine turned over, my phone lit up in the center console. A new text message glowed on the lock screen. It was not from my mother, and it was not from Travis. It was from Paige, my sister-in-law. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the notification unread. Whatever facade she was trying to uphold, whatever illusion she was trying to project, it would have to wait until tomorrow. The real world was about to catch up with them, and I was going to watch it happen from a very safe distance. December 23rd arrived with a biting chill that stripped away the lingering warmth of the previous weeks. The false spring was dead. Frost clung to the corners of my bedroom window, forming intricate, jagged patterns against the glass. The sky outside hung low and gray, a heavy blanket of impending winter pressing down on the city of Wichita. I sat at my small kitchen island, wrapping both hands around a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The apartment was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. My phone rested face down on the granite counter. It had been vibrating in short, frantic bursts since late last night, long after I had returned from the aviation plant. I took a slow sip of the bitter liquid, bracing myself, and reached for the device. The lock screen was crowded with notifications. 9 text messages and 4 picture attachments, all originating from my sister-in-law. Paige and Travis had been married for 3 years. She grew up in a prominent suburban enclave just outside the city limits, the daughter of a local real estate developer who valued aesthetic perfection above all other virtues. Paige was raised to smile for the camera, regardless of the reality hiding behind the lens. She understood the currency of appearances. She knew how to host a country club luncheon, how to dress for a charity gala, and how to project an aura of effortless affluence. She was, in every measurable way, the perfect partner for my brother and his endless theater of success. I tapped the screen, opening the message thread. The first attachment loaded, filling my display with a high-resolution image of a sprawling dining table. The setup was elaborate. Crystal champagne flutes caught the overhead light. Expensive floral centerpieces overflowing with winter roses and silver ribbons stretched down the center of the mahogany wood. A towering catered spread of prime rib, roasted root vegetables, and artisanal pastries sat waiting on silver platters. Below the photograph, her text read, "Such a shame you decided not to join us this year, Leslie. Travis wanted the whole family together to celebrate his banner year. The caterers just dropped off the holiday spread. We are going to have a wonderful time without you. But you will be missed." I swiped to the next image. It was a selfie of Paige and Travis standing in front of a towering flocked Christmas tree. Travis wore a tailored velvet blazer. Paige wore a glittering emerald dress. They held matching crystal glasses, smiling with bright, practiced enthusiasm. But my analytical mind, trained to spot logistical anomalies and hidden flaws, zeroed in on the details. I looked at the timestamps. The first message arrived at 10:45 last night. The final message chimed in at 2:15 in the morning. Why was she sending me photos of a fully catered holiday feast in the middle of the night, 2 days before Christmas? The timeline made zero logical sense. Caterers do not deliver hot prime rib at midnight on the 22nd. I zoomed in on the selfie. The smiles were wide, but the tension radiating from their posture was unmistakable. Travis possessed a rigid tightness in his jaw. Paige gripped her crystal glass so hard her knuckles appeared bone-white against the stem. The sparkle in her eyes looked brittle, resembling glass on the verge of shattering. The messages were framed as boastful updates dripping with passive pity, but they radiated a frantic, suffocating desperation. She was not trying to make me jealous. She was trying to convince herself that the facade was still intact. I did not know the exact nature of the panic unfolding inside their suburban townhouse. Perhaps the credit rejection had already triggered a financial cascade. Perhaps a vendor had arrived demanding immediate payment. Whatever the catalyst, the luxury captured in those photographs felt hollow, like a beautifully decorated stage moments before the theater caught fire. I typed nothing in response. Engaging with the performance would only feed their frantic energy. I deleted the notification, locked the screen, and placed the phone back onto the counter. I refused to participate in their crumbling illusion. To break the quiet isolation of the apartment, I reached for the television remote and turned on the local Wichita News affiliate. The morning broadcast usually provided a steady stream of harmless background noise while I went about my weekend chores. I needed to pack a small duffel bag for my drive tomorrow. I had mapped out the route to the solitary prairie diner, planning to leave my apartment by mid-afternoon on Christmas Eve, securing my quiet sanctuary far away from my parents and their curated family event. The television anchor discussed the incoming weather front, pointing to a sprawling radar map stained in deep shades of blue and purple. A severe winter storm warning was set to take effect by tomorrow evening. The meteorologist warned of plummeting temperatures, blinding winds, and hazardous road conditions across the Central Plains. The isolation I had chosen was about to be enforced by the atmosphere itself. I walked into my bedroom, pulling a thick wool sweater from the top shelf of my closet. As I folded the garment into my canvas bag, the cheerful banter of the morning news team abruptly faded. The tone of the broadcast shifted. The bright, upbeat background music vanished, replaced by a low, driving bass line meant to signal urgent investigative journalism. I paused, my hands resting on the edge of the open duffel bag. This holiday season, a devastating betrayal in the heart of the Great Plains, a deep voice intoned over the television speakers. I stepped back into the living room, my eyes fixing on the flat screen. The broadcast had cut to a commercial promo for a special evening news segment. The screen flashed a rapid montage of stark, unpolished footage. A weathered Kansas farmer stood in a barren dirt driveway, his face etched with exhaustion and profound anger. A middle-aged couple sat at a modest kitchen table, staring blankly at a stack of legal documents. A padlocked chain wrapped tightly around the front gate of a rural storage facility. Millions of dollars vanished. The voiceover continued, the cadence heavy and relentless. Promised returns in the green agricultural energy sector turned to dust. Hard-working local families stripped of their life savings by a sophisticated phantom enterprise. Tomorrow night at 6, our investigative team uncovers the stunning reality behind the ultimate Kansas con. My breath stopped. The air in my living room suddenly felt thick and unbreathable. The camera cut to a tight, shaky shot of a glossy corporate brochure resting on a wooden desk. The lens zoomed in, focusing on the top right corner of the printed page for a fraction of a second. It was a brief, fleeting glimpse, but my eyes recognized the geometry of the shapes instantly. A stylized green horizon line intersecting with a golden sun. It was the exact same corporate logo printed on the audit report currently locked inside the bottom drawer of my desk at the aviation plant. It was the emblem of Apex Horizon Energy. I stood paralyzed on the hardwood floor. The coffee in my mug grew cold. The television screen transitioned to a cheerful commercial for a local car dealership, but the vibrant colors washed over me without registering. The dread I had been carrying for the past 2 days crystallized into sharp, terrifying clarity. The fake invoices routed through my employer were not just the desperate flails of a failing businessman. The staggering commercial loan application tethered to my identity was not merely a shortcut to secure temporary funding. Travis had not just exaggerated his resume or spun a harmless lie to impress our parents. My brother had constructed an immense, predatory Ponzi scheme. He had spent the last several years driving across the state, looking honest, hard-working farmers in the eye and draining their retirement accounts to fund his tailored suits, his luxury vehicles, and his catered holiday feasts. The pristine combine harvester in his social media posts was bait. The visionary title my mother bestowed upon him was the cover story for a devastating financial crime. The sheer scale of the deception shifted the grounds beneath my feet. This was a federal-level offense. The authorities were likely already circling, building their case in the shadows. The local news station had pieced the trail together and was preparing to broadcast the wreckage to the entire region in 36 hours. I looked back at my phone sitting on the kitchen counter. Paige, sending me frantic, boastful photographs at 2 a.m, suddenly made terrifying sense. She was living inside the blast radius. She was desperately clinging to the fine china and the crystal flutes while the walls of her life prepared to cave in. My mother had told me not to come to Christmas because my presence would embarrass my brother. She claimed he was bringing key investors to celebrate a public expansion. Now I knew the truth. There were no key investors coming to dinner. The only people preparing to visit my brother were likely carrying federal warrants. I sank down onto the edge of my living room sofa, my mind racing through the logistical implications. I had legally severed my financial ties. I had frozen my credit. I was insulated from the immediate debt, but the impending explosion was going to incinerate my family. The fallout would rip through their social standing, their assets, and their curated reputation. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. The investigative special aired at 6 o'clock. The quiet, solitary holiday I had planned was about to become the epicenter of a regional scandal, and I was going to have a front row seat to the destruction. The false spring surrendered on the morning of Christmas Eve. The unseasonable warmth that had smothered Kansas for weeks broke with a sudden, vicious snap. A high-pressure front swept down from the north, dropping the temperature 30 degrees in a matter of hours. The sky transformed from a pale blue to a bruised, heavy slate. By noon, the wind began to howl across the flat plains, carrying the first sharp bites of ice. The weather forecasters issued urgent warnings, urging residents to stay off the roads as a blinding whiteout prepared to devour the state. The storm mirrored the impending reality perfectly. The warm, comfortable illusion was dead, and a freezing, isolating truth was moving in to take its place. I left my apartment shortly after 2 in the afternoon. I packed a single canvas bag, threw it onto the passenger seat of my car, and drove away from the city limits. The further I traveled from Wichita, the more the landscape flattened out into endless, dormant wheat fields. The snow started falling in thick, horizontal sheets, obscuring the horizon and painting the world in a stark, blinding white. The tires of my car crunched over the accumulating ice, but I kept my hands steady on the steering wheel, guided by the glowing red lines of the navigation screen on my dashboard. My destination sat 20 miles away from the suburban enclave where my family lived. It was a standalone diner, positioned near a major freight junction, a relic of chrome and red neon that catered primarily to long-haul drivers and solitary travelers. It was a place where people went when they needed a warm meal without the burden of conversation. It was exactly where I needed to be. I pulled into the gravel parking lot just as the blizzard reached its peak. The neon sign above the diner flickered, casting a distorted red glow against the driving snow. I cut the engine, zipped my heavy wool coat to my chin, and pushed my way through the biting wind toward the glass entrance. The heavy door chimed as I stepped inside. A rush of forced warm air hit my face, carrying the comforting scent of roasted coffee, fried potatoes, and melted butter. The interior was almost entirely hollow. 2 truck drivers sat at the far end of the counter, nursing ceramic mugs and staring quietly into space. I chose a booth in the back corner, sliding into the worn red vinyl seat. The window beside me offered a clear view of the raging storm outside. The glass felt ice-cold against my shoulder, a tangible boundary separating the warmth of the diner from the lethal elements beyond the pane. A waitress wearing a faded blue apron walked over, setting a laminated menu and a glass of water on the table. She looked tired, but offered a genuine, unforced smile. I did not need the menu. I ordered a slice of warm cherry pie and a cup of black coffee. As I waited, I allowed my mind to drift back to the suburban townhouse. I pictured the dining room from the photographs Paige had sent the night before. I imagined my mother Diane meticulously adjusting the silver centerpieces, ensuring the crystal flutes caught the light just right. I imagined Martin pouring expensive wine, boasting about his visionary son to anyone who would listen. They had spent weeks cultivating the perfect atmosphere, pushing me away because my pragmatic questions threatened to ruin their aesthetic. They were sitting inside a beautifully decorated stage, entirely oblivious to the smell of smoke creeping under the floorboards. The waitress returned, sliding a thick ceramic plate onto the table. The cherry pie steamed in the cool air, the dark red fruit bubbling beneath a golden flaky crust. The coffee was scalding hot and pleasantly bitter. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into my skin. Above the main counter, a large television set played quietly. It was tuned to the local Wichita news affiliate, currently displaying a cheerful holiday graphic, while the anchors discussed the historic snowfall blanketing the region. The digital clock in the corner of the screen read 5:55. I took a slow bite of the pie. The tartness of the cherries provided a sharp contrast to the sweet crust. I ate methodically, watching the snow bury the empty highway outside my window. The isolation I had chosen felt earned. I had built a fortress around my identity, legally severing the ties that bound me to their sinking ship. I was safe, sitting in the warm glow of a roadside diner, insulated from the blast radius. The digital clock on the television rolled over to 6 o'clock. The cheerful holiday music abruptly cut out. The screen faded to black for a fraction of a second before a deep, resonant bass line filled the diner. The two truck drivers at the counter looked up from their coffee. The waitress paused near the register, a cleaning cloth resting idle in her hand. The broadcast began with a stark, unpolished image of a weathered Kansas farmer standing in a barren dirt driveway. His face was etched with exhaustion and profound betrayal. The camera panned over a chain-link fence secured with heavy padlocks guarding an empty, snow-covered storage lot. The news anchor appeared on the screen. His expression was grim, devoid of the usual evening broadcast charm. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying a heavy, relentless cadence. "We begin tonight with a special investigative report, a devastating financial betrayal in the heart of the Great Plains. Millions of dollars vanished. Promised returns in the green agricultural energy sector turned to dust. Hard-working local families stripped of their life savings by a sophisticated phantom enterprise." My fork clinked against the ceramic plate. I set it down, my eyes locking onto the glowing screen. The broadcast cut to a polished graphic. The emblem of Apex Horizon Energy flashed across the screen. The stylized green horizon line and golden sun rendered in sharp detail. For the past 3 years, the anchor continued a Wichita-based operation known as Apex Horizon Energy has solicited immense investments from rural communities across Kansas. The pitch was modern and lucrative. The company promised to revolutionize local farming by leasing state-of-the-art green energy equipment and returning high-yield dividends to early investors. Our investigative team has spent the last month tracing the paperwork, and tonight, we can reveal the stunning reality. The screen transitioned to a familiar photograph. It was the same image I had seen on social media 2 days ago. Travis, grinning in a tailored navy blazer, standing in front of a pristine combine harvester. "The company is an empty shell," the reporter stated. "There are no equipment leases. There are no state utility partnerships. The machinery used in promotional materials was rented by the hour. The funds gathered from local farmers were never invested in agriculture. They were used to fund an elaborate high-end lifestyle and to pay off early investors in a classic textbook Ponzi scheme." The waitress let out a soft gasp, her hand covering her mouth as she stared at the television. The report dove into the logistical details, appealing directly to my analytical mind. The journalists laid out the paper trail, showing how the fake corporate entity funneled money through various shell accounts. They interviewed a retired couple who had mortgaged their family farm to invest in the phantom green energy grid, wiping tears from their eyes as they realized their retirement was gone. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering. "The primary architect of this operation has been identified as 30-year-old Travis Rogers," the reporter announced. A tight shot of the suburban townhouse filled the screen. The very same house where the catered prime rib and crystal champagne flutes currently sat on a mahogany dining table. Federal authorities operating in conjunction with state financial regulators initiated a sweeping action late this afternoon, the broadcast detailed. The Securities and Exchange Commission has officially frozen all corporate and personal assets tied to Apex Horizon Energy. Warrants have been executed, and an active federal investigation is currently underway to locate the missing funds. The television displayed a final graphic listing a hotline number for victims to call and report their financial losses. The anchor offered a few solemn words about the devastating impact on the local agricultural community before transitioning to a commercial break. The diner fell dead silent. The only sound remaining was the fierce howling of the blizzard rattling the window pane beside my booth. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the table. The coffee in my mug had stopped steaming. The truth was no longer a secret locked inside the bottom drawer of my desk at the aviation plant. It was no longer a quiet suspicion or a hidden commercial registry audit. It was public knowledge, broadcast into hundreds of thousands of living rooms across the state of Kansas. The farmers knew. The neighbors knew. The country club friends knew. Travis was not a visionary. He was a federal target. I looked out the window. The snow was falling harder now, burying the roads in an impenetrable layer of ice. The freezing temperatures outside were a flawless reflection of my brother's financial reality. Every bank account, every credit line, every hidden shell corporation was now locked down by the federal government. My parents had uninvited me because they wanted to preserve a perfect atmosphere. They had curated a holiday dinner for a phantom mogul preparing to celebrate a man who had stolen the life savings of the very people who built this state. I picked up my fork and took another bite of the cherry pie. It tasted grounding. It tasted like survival. I knew what was happening in the suburban townhouse at this exact moment. The phones were likely ringing. The carefully arranged facade was disintegrating. The social standing my mother treasured above her own daughter was currently evaporating on live television. The digital and social fallout was going to hit them with the force of a freight train, and because of the boundaries I had drawn, they were going to have to stand on the tracks alone. The drive back to my apartment on Christmas morning was slow and treacherous. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a frozen, silent city buried under a foot of snow. The plow trucks had cleared the main highways, but the residential streets were a mess of packed ice and abandoned vehicles. I kept the heater blasting, gripping the steering wheel as the tires struggled for traction. The physical isolation of the storm was lifting, but the digital fallout from the evening news broadcast was just beginning to hit. By the time I unlocked my door and stepped into the warm entryway, my phone was already vibrating with a relentless rhythm. I tossed my keys onto the counter and dropped my heavy canvas bag onto the floor. I did not need to check the screen to know what was happening. The blast wave had reached the suburbs. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, wrapped a thick fleece blanket over my shoulders, and sat down at the kitchen island. I unlocked my phone, intending to clear the notifications, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened a local community message board, a popular forum where residents of my parents' wealthy suburban neighborhood usually discuss trivial matters like landscaping disputes and upcoming charity auctions. Today, the forum was unrecognizable. The front page was dominated by a single thread pinned to the top by the site administrators. The title read in bold, angry letters, "Apex Horizon Energy Fraud." The thread had over 300 comments and counting. I scrolled through the initial posts. The fury was palpable. The first wave of anger came from the immediate neighbors, the people who lived down the street from my parents. These were individuals who had attended the same country club, shared the same tennis courts, and sat through endless dinner parties listening to Martin and Diane boast about their visionary son. The neighbors felt personally humiliated. They expressed outrage that a federal investigation was unfolding in their pristine neighborhood, worried that the scandal would tank their property values. Then the second wave hit. These comments were not concerned with property values or social embarrassment. These were the voices of the victims. A user claiming to be a retired mechanic from a nearby farming town posted a blistering account of how Travis had convinced him to empty his pension fund into the phantom green energy grid. The mechanic described sitting in his living room, pouring coffee for a man in a tailored navy blazer who promised steady, reliable returns. The post ended with a direct, chilling demand for the Rogers family to return the stolen money. The outrage cascaded down the page. Another user, claiming to be the daughter of an elderly couple who had mortgaged their home to invest with Apex, posted photographs of her parents crying. She tagged my mother directly, asking how Diane could post pictures of catered prime rib while elderly farmers faced foreclosure. The digital mob was ruthless, systematic, and entirely justified. They were dismantling my family's curated reputation post by post, exposing the rotten foundation beneath the luxury. I navigated away from the community board and opened my personal social media feed. The algorithm instantly pushed Paige's profile to the top. I tapped on her name, bracing for whatever frantic illusion she was attempting to maintain. Her profile was gone. The account had been deactivated or deleted entirely. The photographs of the towering Christmas tree, the crystal champagne flutes, and the emerald dresses had vanished into the digital void. She had pulled the plug, realizing that every display of wealth was now evidence of complicity. I switched over to my mother's profile. Diane had not deleted her account, but she had locked it down, restricting access and disabling comments on every single photograph. I scrolled back to the image of Travis standing in front of the combine harvester, the post where Diane had proudly labeled him a visionary. The comment section, previously filled with praise and congratulations, was now a barren wasteland. She had scrubbed the public record, desperately trying to erase the connection between her pride and his crime. But the internet possesses a long, unforgiving memory. A local Wichita news blog had already published an aggregation article compiling screenshots of every boastful post Diane and Travis had ever made. The article highlighted the stark contrast between the stolen funds and the lavish lifestyle, laying bare the hypocrisy for the entire region to dissect. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen. For 32 years, my parents had valued their social standing above all else. They had funded Travis's endless string of failures, sacrificed my college tuition, and ultimately uninvited me from Christmas dinner solely to protect the illusion of success. They had built their entire identity around the perception of wealth and influence. Now that identity was radioactive. The same country club friends who had praised Martin's business acumen were likely blocking his calls. The neighbors who had envied Diane's perfectly manicured lawn were probably throwing trash into her hedges. The community they had so desperately tried to impress was currently sharpening pitchforks. My phone vibrated again, breaking my train of thought. A text message from Garrett, my supervisor at the aviation plant, appeared on the screen. Saw the morning news, the message read. You were right to lock the doors. Take tomorrow off if you need it. We will handle the floor. I typed a quick reply thanking him for the support, but assuring him I would be at my desk for my scheduled shift. Work was the only anchor I had left. I needed the logic of supply chains and the reliable rhythm of the factory to keep me grounded, while the rest of my world spun out of control. I set the phone down and walked over to the living room window. The sun was beginning to break through the lingering clouds, reflecting blindingly off the fresh snow. The city looked peaceful, a stark contrast to the digital war zone I had just witnessed. I felt a strange, profound sense of detachment. I was watching a tragedy unfold, a tragedy involving my own blood, but I felt no urge to intervene. I did not want to call my mother and offer comfort. I did not want to call my father and ask how they planned to navigate the legal fallout. I did not want to check on Travis. They had made their choices. They had actively chosen the illusion over reality. They had chosen the golden boy over the pragmatic daughter. They had demanded a perfect atmosphere, and now they were suffocating in it. I walked back to the kitchen island, picked up my empty coffee mug, and placed it in the sink. The silence in the apartment felt different today. It was not the heavy, anxious silence of exclusion. It was the clear, resonant silence of survival. I had built a fortress, and the storm was breaking exactly where it was supposed to. I turned on the hot water, watching the dark remnants of the coffee swirl down the drain. My financial identity was secure. My job was safe. My boundary was intact. I would not reach out. I would not offer a lifeline. I would let gravity do its work, pulling the house of cards down until nothing remained but the foundation. But gravity is rarely a quiet force. It tends to pull everything into the collapse, and desperation makes people unpredictable. The illusion was shattered, but the instinct to survive was just waking up. They were cornered, humiliated, and facing the devastating reality of a federal investigation. People backed into a corner rarely accept defeat gracefully. They usually start looking for someone else to take the fall. I dried my hands on a towel, the faint realization creeping into my mind. The public humiliation was only the first phase. The legal and financial consequences were still looming, a massive wave gathering strength off the coast. When the authorities started demanding restitution and the attorneys started demanding retainers, the social embarrassment would quickly morph into raw, existential panic. They were going to need a scapegoat. They were going to need a bailout. And they were going to look toward the only person who had ever provided a reliable safety net. I glanced back at my phone, sitting silently on the granite counter. The screen was dark, but the quiet felt fragile, like a brief intermission before the second act. The digital mob had forced them into hiding, but eventually the shock would wear off and the desperation would take over. When that happened, the silence would break. The evening hours of Christmas Eve dragged by with a heavy, deliberate pace. I sat in my quiet apartment, the only illumination coming from a small reading lamp beside the sofa and the soft glow of the television set playing a muted holiday movie. Outside, the blizzard had finally exhausted itself. The wind died down, leaving behind a frozen, silent city buried under pristine, white snow. The contrast between the tranquil exterior and the devastating reality unfolding miles away in my parents' suburban neighborhood was profound. I tried to focus on a logistics manual I had brought home from the plant, but the words blurred together. My mind kept returning to the image of the padlocked storage facility from the news broadcast. I thought about the farmers, the retired mechanics, and the elderly couples who had trusted my brother. Travis had leveraged the aesthetic of success, the tailored suits, the leased combine harvesters, the curated social media presence, to steal their futures. My parents had financed that aesthetic. They had paid for the stage he performed on, and now the authorities were bringing down the curtain. As midnight approached, the tension in my apartment thickened. The digital mob had forced my family into hiding, but I knew the shock would eventually wear off. The initial embarrassment of the public broadcast would soon be replaced by the terrifying, existential reality of federal law enforcement. They were cornered. They were out of options. The golden boy had fallen, and they were going to look for a net. I glanced at the digital clock on my microwave. It read 11:58. I stood up, walked to the kitchen island, and poured myself a glass of cold water. I took a slow sip, letting the chill run down my throat, grounding myself in the physical moment. I was safe. I was legally insulated. The firewall I had constructed at the law firm 3 days ago was impenetrable. The commercial loan application was dead. My credit was frozen. My identity was secure. The clock ticked over to 12:01. My phone, resting face down on the granite counter, vibrated. The sound was sharp and invasive, cutting through the quiet of the apartment like a physical blow. The device hummed continuously, the screen glowing against the dark surface. I did not move immediately. I stood perfectly still, watching the phone vibrate, knowing exactly who was on the other end of the line. I set my water glass down, picked up the phone, and flipped it over. The caller ID confirmed my expectation. Mom. I swiped the green icon and brought the speaker to my ear. I did not say hello. I did not offer a seasonal greeting. I simply waited. Leslie Diane cried out, her voice cracking immediately. It was not her usual polished country club tone. It was a raw, hysterical wail, stripped of all pretense and dignity. "Leslie, you have to help us!" The desperation in her voice was absolute. For 32 years, my mother had maintained an image of impenetrable grace. She was the woman who sent back expensive wine if it tasted faintly corked. She was the woman who curated her family like a museum exhibit. Hearing her reduced to frantic sobbing was surreal. "What is happening, Mom?" I asked, keeping my voice low and level, offering zero emotional leverage. "They took everything." She sobbed, the words tumbling out in a breathless panic. "The federal agents were here. They came to the house, Leslie. They had warrants. They took Travis' computers, his files, his phone. They even took his car from the driveway." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, visualizing the scene. A fleet of dark vehicles parked in their pristine suburban driveway. Federal agents walking past the expensive floral centerpieces and the crystal champagne flutes carrying out boxes of evidence. The ultimate humiliation playing out in front of the neighbors she had spent decades trying to impress. "Is Travis arrested?" I asked, maintaining my clinical detachment. "Not yet," she wailed, her voice pitching higher. They questioned him for hours and told him not to leave the state. But they froze his accounts, Leslie. Every single bank account tied to him, to the business, to Paige. It is all locked down. The Securities and Exchange Commission issued a federal freeze. He cannot access a single dime. The reality of the situation was settling in. The house of cards had completely collapsed. The phantom green energy empire was dead, and the federal government had seized control of the wreckage. "He needs a defense attorney immediately." Diane continued the hysteria, giving way to a frantic, grasping urgency. "A specialist in federal financial crimes. We found a firm in Kansas City willing to take the case, but they require a massive retainer upfront. They will not even review his files without a $50,000 deposit." I opened my eyes, staring at the dark window of my kitchen. The reflection staring back at me was calm, unreadable. "And why are you calling me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Because we cannot access our liquidity right now," she replied, her tone shifting seamlessly back into the entitled demands I had grown up with. "The scandal is causing a delay with our primary financial institution. We need you to wire $50,000 to the law firm first thing in the morning." The sheer audacity of the request hung in the quiet apartment. Less than 2 weeks ago, this same woman had called me to explicitly uninvite me from their family Christmas dinner because my pragmatic nature would embarrass my brother. She had told me I lacked vision. She had told me to stay in Wichita and let Travis have his moment. Now, at midnight on Christmas, while her golden boy faced federal indictment for a massive Ponzi scheme, she was demanding I empty my life savings to buy him a defense attorney. "Mom," I said, my voice steady, cutting through her frantic energy. "Do you realize what you are asking me to do?" "I am asking you to save your brother," she snapped, the polished entitlement returning in full force. "He made a mistake, Leslie. A severe miscalculation with his investment strategy. The local news exaggerated everything. It is a misunderstanding, but the feds are acting aggressively. We need top-tier legal representation to sort this out, and you have the liquid capital. You have always been so frugal. A severe miscalculation. That was how she chose to frame the theft of millions of dollars from local farmers. She was still trying to protect the illusion, still trying to sanitize his crimes, still expecting me to act as the invisible safety net. I have $50,000 in my personal savings account, I stated plainly. It is the money I saved by working overnight shifts while you bought Travis a brand new truck. It is the money I saved by skipping vacations while you financed his downtown lofts. Do not start this now, she interrupted, her voice rising in frustration. Do not make this about your petty jealousy. This is an emergency. Your brother is facing federal prison. We are your family. You owe us your support. The word hung in the air. Oh. I thought about the commercial loan inquiry. I thought about the $850,000 debt they had attempted to secretly change my identity. They had tried to use my pristine credit as a guarantor for his phantom company, and when that failed, they were now explicitly demanding I hand over my actual cash. To them, I was not a daughter. I was a resource. I was an emergency fund they could tap into whenever the golden boy failed. I am not wiring you a single dollar, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. There was a profound silence on the other end of the line. The sobbing stopped. The frantic energy vanished, replaced by a cold, stunned shock. What did you just say? She whispered, the entitlement fracturing. I am not giving you $50,000 to defend a criminal, I repeated, enunciating every syllable clearly. Leslie, you listen to me. Diane hissed, the desperation returning, tinged with genuine panic. You do not understand the severity of this situation. If we do not secure this attorney, Travis is going to be indicted by the end of the week. They are threatening to seize this house. You have the money. You have to wire it. I stood in my quiet kitchen, listening to the woman who had treated me like a disposable burden my entire life demand my salvation. The dramatic irony of the moment was absolute. She was screaming into the void, completely unaware that I had legally severed my ties 3 days ago. She was unaware of the affidavit, unaware of the credit freeze, unaware that the colossal commercial loan they tried to force upon me was already dead. She was demanding power she no longer possessed. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, savoring the absolute lack of leverage she held. The panic on her end of the line was suffocating, but it was not my panic. It belonged entirely to them. The digital mob had isolated them. The federal agents had dismantled them. And now the pragmatic, invisible daughter was about to deliver the final, crushing blow. The silence on the line stretched out heavy and absolute. I could hear my mother's ragged breathing, a sharp contrast to the suffocating quiet in my kitchen. The frantic, demanding energy she had wielded moments ago had shattered against the wall of my refusal. For 32 years, my role in the family dynamic was fixed. I was the reliable, invisible scaffolding that supported their curated illusion. I absorbed the slights, paid my own way, and stepped aside whenever the golden boy required the spotlight. Diane had expected me to automatically fulfill that role tonight, to act as the emergency bankroll without question. She expected the pragmatic daughter to fall into line. Are you serious? Diane finally gasped, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with raw disbelief. You are seriously going to abandon your brother when he is facing federal prison? Over some petty grudge about a dinner invitation? It is not a grudge, Mom, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level, letting the cold reality of the situation anchor every syllable. It is a boundary you established 2 weeks ago. I stood by the kitchen island, staring out at the frozen, silent city. The blizzard had buried everything, creating an impenetrable layer of ice that mirrored the emotional fortress I was currently defending. "Do you remember what you said to me when you uninvited me?" I continued, not allowing her a fraction of a second to interrupt. "You said it was a family event. You said my presence would embarrass Travis. You told me you needed a supportive environment for his investors, and my practical questions were exhausting. You explicitly told me I was not part of the family event." I am holding the phone, listening to the woman who prioritized aesthetic perfection over her own daughter try to rewrite history in real time. "Leslie, you are twisting my words," Diane hissed, launching into her familiar strategy of gaslighting. "I never said you were not family. I said the timing was sensitive. Travis was under an immense amount of pressure trying to finalize his expansion, and we thought it was best if we kept the gathering focused on his achievements. It was not a rejection. It was a strategic decision to help your brother succeed. He succeeded in stealing millions of dollars from Kansas farmers." I countered, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. "He succeeded in building a massive Ponzi scheme that the Securities and Exchange Commission just dismantled on live television. That is not an achievement, Mom. It is a federal crime." "Do not speak about him like that!" she screamed, the polished veneer cracking open to reveal the ferocious, blind loyalty that had always defined her relationship with him. "He is a visionary." The local news exaggerated the situation. The investors were impatient. The market fluctuated. If we can just secure this defense attorney, we can clarify the misunderstandings. We just need the retainer fee, Leslie. $50,000. It is a small price to pay to save this family. The denial was breathtaking. She was standing inside a burning house, choking on the smoke and demanding I buy her a bucket of paint to touch up the walls. The federal agents had hauled boxes of evidence out of her suburban driveway, yet she was still trying to maintain the illusion that Travis was simply a misunderstood entrepreneur. I thought about the $850,000 commercial loan application. They had attempted to secretly chain me to his sinking ship, assuming I would just absorb the debt and keep quiet. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was a revelation. It stripped away decades of guilt and obligation. "I do not owe you $50,000, I stated, enunciating every word clearly to ensure there was zero ambiguity. "I do not owe you a defense attorney. I do not owe Travis salvation from his own fraudulent choices. You financed his lifestyle. You paid for his downtown lofts and his luxury trucks. You curated his fake empire, and you actively excluded me because I saw the truth." "Leslie, please," Diane sobbed, her tone shifting violently from anger to desperate pleading. "We have nothing left. They froze his accounts. They froze Paige's accounts. The bank is reviewing our personal assets because of our association with the company. We are tapped out. If you do not wire this money, he is going to be indicted. He is going to lose everything." "He already lost everything," I replied, my voice steady, feeling a profound sense of detachment from her panic. "And you are going to lose everything too. Because you built your entire identity around a phantom. You chose the illusion over reality, Mom. You made your investment. Now you have to live with the returns." "I am your mother!" she wailed, the final desperate card played. "You cannot do this! You cannot just cut us off when we are drowning! We are your family!" "Family protects family," I said quietly. "You never protected me. You used me." The silence returned, thick and suffocating. The realization was finally settling over her. The invisible daughter, the pragmatic safety net, had officially withdrawn her services. The bank was closed. I listened to her shallow breathing for a long moment. There was no joy in this victory. There was no triumphant satisfaction in hearing her panic. There was only a cold, clinical release. The heavy, invisible chain that had bound me to their expectations for 32 years finally snapped. "Do not call me again," I said. "Leslie, wait, please!" Diane cried out, the desperation peaking. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I did not hesitate. I tapped the red button ending the call. The screen illuminated the dark kitchen for a few seconds before fading to black. I opened the contact list, navigated to my mother's profile, and selected the block caller option. The confirmation prompt appeared on the screen. I tapped confirm. I repeated the process for Martin. I repeated the process for Travis. I systematically severed every digital connection, isolating my phone from the epicenter of the blast radius. The definitive click of locking the screen echoed in the quiet apartment. It was the loudest sound I had heard all night. I walked over to the living room window and pressed my hand against the cold glass. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the city buried under a pristine layer of white. The storm had passed, and the Kansas plains were settling into a deep, frozen slumber. The false spring was dead, replaced by a harsh, undeniable reality. I had made my choice. I had chosen my own survival over their comfort. I had chosen the quiet isolation of my apartment over the chaotic destruction of their suburban pretense. I was completely unburdened, standing outside the wreckage, watching the house of cards collapse exactly as gravity intended. The physical distance between my apartment and their suburban neighborhood was only 20 miles, but it might as well have been another planet. They were entering a world defined by federal subpoenas, frozen assets, and public humiliation. I was entering a world defined by logistics spreadsheets and the quiet satisfaction of a clean break. I turned away from the window, pulling the thick fleece blanket tighter around my shoulders. I was exhausted, the kind of deep bone weariness that follows a prolonged adrenaline spike. I walked toward my bedroom, ready to sleep for the first time in 3 days. The immediate threat was neutralized. The boundary was enforced. But as I pulled the covers back and climbed into bed, a quiet realization crept into my mind. Diane's desperate midnight call was a symptom of a larger systemic collapse. The federal freeze had locked down everything, plunging Travis and Paige into immediate financial ruin. People accustomed to luxury do not handle sudden poverty with grace. Paige had sent those frantic, boastful photographs just 24 hours ago, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of control while the federal agents closed in. Now her accounts were frozen. The catered holiday spread was likely rotting on the mahogany dining table. The golden boy she had married was facing decades in federal prison. The pressure inside that suburban townhouse was immense, and pressure always seeks an escape route. Diane had failed to extract a bailout from me, which meant the panic was only going to escalate. The facade was completely gone, leaving nothing but raw survival instinct. The next wave of fallout was coming, and it was not going to originate from the parents. It was going to come from the people trapped inside the blast radius, scrambling to find a lifeboat before the ship finally slipped beneath the surface. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet of the apartment wash over me. The storm outside had settled, but the wreckage was still shifting. The true cost of the illusion was just beginning to manifest, and the collateral damage was going to be devastating. December 26th brought a slow, steady thaw to the city of Wichita. The bitter wind that had defined Christmas Eve retreated, replaced by a pale winter sun that turned the heavy snowbanks into dripping gray slush. The rhythmic sound of melting ice falling from the roof of my apartment building felt like a ticking clock. The world was waking up from the holiday freeze, and the true consequences of the federal raid were beginning to surface. I spent the morning organizing my home office, preparing to return to the aviation plant the following day. My phone remained silent. The digital blockade I had placed on my parents and my brother held firm. I existed in a pristine, quiet vacuum, entirely insulated from the panic that was undoubtedly suffocating the suburban townhouse. Just before noon, the silence broke. My phone vibrated against the wooden surface of my desk. I glanced at the screen, expecting an automated work email or a text from my supervisor. Instead, the caller identification displayed a name I had not blocked, simply because I had not expected her to ever reach out. Paige. I stared at the glowing screen. Travis and his wife operated as a unified front, presenting a flawless, curated aesthetic to the world. She was the perfect accessory to his visionary persona, the woman who smiled in the emerald dresses and posted photographs of catered holiday feasts. I assumed she was standing by his side, coordinating with defense attorneys and maintaining the illusion of grace under pressure. I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. "I am leaving him," Paige said. She did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how I was doing. Her voice was breathy, frantic, and laced with a raw, undeniable terror. Through the speaker, I could hear the unmistakable sounds of chaotic destruction: hangers scraping harshly across a metal closet rod, heavy canvas bags being dragged across hardwood floors, the sharp, tearing sound of packing tape. "Paige," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Where are you?" "I am in the master bedroom," she replied, her breath hitching as she spoke. "My father sent his corporate attorney and a moving crew. They are waiting downstairs. I am taking whatever the federal agents did not already tag, and I am going back to my parents' house." The image of the pristine, curated townhouse being dismantled piece by piece materialized in my mind. Paige had been raised in a wealthy enclave by a prominent real estate developer. She was taught to recognize a sinking ship, and more importantly, she was taught how to secure a lifeboat before the water reached the upper decks. She was cutting her losses. "He lied to me, Leslie," she continued, the frantic energy turning into a bitter, venomous anger. "He sat at the dining table on Christmas Eve and told me the news broadcast was a smear campaign. He promised me the attorneys would fix it. Then the federal agents kicked the front door open at 6 a.m. They took my jewelry. They took the keys to my car. They told me my name is on the incorporation documents for 3 of his shell companies. I could go to prison for this." "You signed the paperwork," I stated, offering zero sympathy. "He told me they were tax shelters," she cried, a heavy zipper closing in the background. "Your parents told me it was standard practice for a growing energy firm." Diane sat right there on the sofa and told me I was lucky to be married to such a brilliant entrepreneur. She paused, her breathing ragged. The sound of moving boxes shifted through the phone. When she spoke again, the panic in her voice had cooled into a sharp, vindictive edge. She was calling for a reason. She was fleeing the wreckage, but she wanted to inflict one final wound on the people who had dragged her into the blast radius. "You think they uninvited you because you are an embarrassment?" Paige asked, her tone dripping with dark irony. "You think Diane just wanted a peaceful dinner without your practical questions?" I stayed quiet, letting her unravel the secret. "They needed you at that table, Leslie. They needed you sitting right next to the crystal centerpieces. Diane and Martin had a commercial loan guarantee printed and sitting inside a leather portfolio in the home office. They invited 2 local real estate brokers to the dinner, pretending they were key investors. The plan was to wait until after dessert, pour you a glass of expensive wine, and corner you. They were going to leverage the holiday cheer and the audience to pressure you into signing your name on an $850,000 debt. The sheer mechanics of the trap settled over me. It was worse than an unverified digital signature. They had orchestrated a physical ambush. They intended to use social pressure, family guilt, and public humiliation to force my hand. ensuring I became the permanent financial anchor for Travis and his failing empire. "So why did Diane call and tell me to stay away?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "Because Travis found out about their plan," Paige revealed, letting out a dry, humorless laugh. "Your father showed Travis the paperwork on the 21st, thinking he would be proud of the bailout they arranged. Travis lost his mind. He had a screaming match with Diane in the kitchen." Paige lowered her voice, mimicking the frantic terror my brother had exhibited. "He told them you run vendor compliance for an aerospace defense contractor. He told Diane that if they put a commercial loan application in front of you, you would not just sign it. You would demand to see the corporate charter. You would ask for the state tax filings. You would request the logistics manifests. He told your parents that you would spot the fraud in 30 seconds and alert the authorities before he could secure his escape funds." The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. "Travis forced them to uninvite you," Paige continued. The final pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. He was sweating bullets. He knew you were the only person in this entire family smart enough to burn his house down. He ordered Diane to keep you away. Diane spun it as you being a pragmatic buzzkill to save her own pride, but the truth is, your brother was terrified of you. I stood in the center of my home office, staring out the window at the melting snow. For 32 years, I believed I was the outcast. I believed my pragmatic nature, my insistence on logic, and my quiet independence made me unworthy of their affection. I had accepted my role as the invisible daughter, the uncelebrated shadow standing behind the golden boy. But the narrative was a lie. I was not the shadow. I was the threat. Travis did not exclude me because I was an embarrassment. He excluded me because I was the apex predator in his financial ecosystem. He knew his tailored suits and rented combine harvesters could fool the country club, but they could never survive a logistics audit. The insult that had stung me so deeply 2 weeks ago was not a rejection. It was an act of profound self-preservation. They were trying to put a leash on a wolf, and the wolf was too dangerous to invite inside the house. "I have to go," Paige said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The movers are taking my bags to the car. I am blocking his number. I am blocking Diane. They are on their own now." "Paige," I said, stopping her before she could sever the line. "What?" "Good luck with the federal prosecutors," I replied, my tone flat and uncompromising. I ended the call, pulling the phone away from my ear. The silence in my apartment returned, but it felt entirely different. It was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the silence of absolute, undeniable victory. The trap had been meticulously set. The wine was poured, the actors were in place, and the snare was waiting. But the prey was too sharp to catch. By forcing me away, Travis had unwittingly shielded me from the very raid that was currently dismantling his life. I walked over to my desk and sat down in the heavy leather chair. The pieces on the board had drastically shifted. Paige had defected, taking her wealthy family resources with her. Travis was isolated, facing federal indictment without a wife or a corporate shield. And my parents, who had remortgaged their own souls to protect their golden boy, were now standing alone in the wreckage. They had lost their primary target when I legally severed the commercial loan authorization. They had lost their secondary target when Paige fled the townhouse. They were running out of options, and the walls were closing in fast. The federal freeze meant the bank would inevitably start looking for collateral to cover the initial smaller debts Travis had incurred over the years. Martin and Diane had spent decades funding the illusion. Now the bill was due. The false spring was over, and the true cost of their delusion was about to land directly on their doorstep. The next move would not be a frantic midnight phone call. It would be an act of sheer, unadulterated, desperation. I set the phone down on the smooth leather surface of my desk mat. The screen went dark, but my mind illuminated with terrifying clarity. I closed my eyes and pictured the alternate timeline. The timeline where I drove to the suburban townhouse on Christmas Eve. I envisioned sitting at that mahogany dining table surrounded by crystal flutes and forced laughter. I pictured my father sliding a leather portfolio across the table after dessert, offering me a glass of expensive wine, urging me to sign my name on the dotted line. And then the front door bursting open, federal agents pouring into the foyer, the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the manicured lawn. If my mother had her way, I would have been sitting right there, holding a pen over a fraudulent commercial loan document when the Securities and Exchange Commission executed their raid. I would have been caught in the epicenter of a federal crime scene, my pristine corporate reputation shattered by mere proximity. Travis saving me was the ultimate irony. My brother did not care about my well-being. He cared about his survival. He knew my logistical training was a lethal threat to his fragile empire. The very pragmatism my mother despised was the exact weapon that terrified my brother. He pushed me out of the blast radius not to protect me, but to protect himself from my scrutiny. The insults that had broken my heart 2 weeks ago was actually a bulletproof shield. I had spent days mourning a rejection that ultimately kept me out of federal prison. The relief was profound, but my analytical instincts demanded verification. I needed concrete proof that the snare was permanently disabled. I checked the digital clock on my computer monitor. It was early afternoon on December 26th. Most professional offices were closed for the holiday week, but high-tier corporate attorneys rarely turned their phones off. I found Elliot Cole in my contacts and dialed his direct line. He answered on the third ring, his voice crisp and alert. I did not waste time with seasonal pleasantries. I told him about the evening news broadcast. I detailed the federal raid on my brother's home. I relayed the revelation from my sister-in-law regarding the physical ambush my parents had planned. I listened to the steady scratch of his pen, taking notes on the other end of the line. When I finished, a long, heavy silence stretched between us. Your timing was surgical, Leslie Elliott said, his tone carrying a rare note of professional admiration. The underwriting firm processed your identity misuse affidavit yesterday morning. They flagged the inquiry as fraudulent and terminated the application instantly. The commercial loan is dead. You are entirely insulated from that debt. I exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding for days. Are you certain there is no residual exposure? I asked, leaning back in my chair. Can the federal investigators trace the initial application back to my door and assume I was complicit? Elliot remained calm and definitive. The federal freeze targets the beneficiaries of the fraud. You did not receive a single dime. You explicitly blocked the transaction and filed a legal declaration of non-involvement before the authorities even executed their warrants. You are a hostile witness to their scheme, not a co-conspirator. Your financial identity is pristine. They cannot touch you. The validation felt like a physical weight lifting from my shoulders. The firewall held. The corporate machinery had functioned exactly as designed, protecting the asset and rejecting the anomaly. The conversation shifted toward the remaining variables. If the $850,000 commercial loan failed, Travis was left without a parachute when the federal agents arrived. But the shockwave was not going to stop at his doorstep. I asked Elliot what happens to the secondary targets. What happens to the people who funded the lifestyle and enabled the illusion? The government will seize whatever liquid assets they can locate tied directly to the Phantom Energy Company, Elliot explained, his voice taking on a clinical edge. But the private creditors, the banks, the leasing agencies who provided the luxury vehicles in the downtown lofts, they will not wait for a federal judge. They're going to start pulling collateral immediately. If your parents co-signed any of his early ventures, or if they leveraged their own property to secure his debts, The banks will begin foreclosure proceedings before the snow melts. I thanked Elliot for his time, ended the call, and set the phone back on the desk. The chessboard was clear. I was off the board entirely. Travis was locked in a federal nightmare. Paige was fleeing to her wealthy enclave, securing her own legal defense. That left Martin and Diane isolated in the suburbs, holding the bag for a ruined empire. They had spent decades funneling their resources into a phantom, and now the collectors were coming to balance the ledger. The irony was staggering. They had curated an aesthetic of immense wealth, treating me like a burdensome peasant because I worked a salaried job and wore practical clothes. Now, my modest apartment and steady paycheck were the only secure assets left in the entire Rogers family. The suburban townhouse they prized so highly was about to become a target. My mother had wept on the phone at midnight, demanding $50,000 to save her son. But the true panic had not even started. The federal agents only took the fraudulent money. The banks were going to take the house. I walked into my kitchen and poured a fresh glass of water. The winter sun cast long, pale shadows across the hardwood floor. Outside, the melting ice dripped steadily from the gutters. The silence in my home was beautiful. I did not have to hire defense attorneys. I did not have to dodge local reporters looking for a quote. I did not have to wonder which of my possessions were going to be repossessed by dawn. I had bought my peace with a painful rejection, and the return on that investment was priceless. My logistical training allowed me to view the situation without the cloud of familial sentiment. A supply chain built on deceit eventually collapses under the weight of its own lies. My parents had supplied the capital, Travis had supplied the fiction, and the local farmers had paid the price. The equation was balancing itself out. The universe was enforcing a harsh, undeniable audit. But peace is a rare commodity, and desperate people despise watching someone else enjoy it. My parents had failed to ambush me at Christmas. They had failed to extort me over the phone. Every avenue they tried to secure a bailout had resulted in a dead end. However, Martin and Diane were survivors in their own twisted way. They were accustomed to maintaining a certain standard of living, and they would not surrender their manicured lawn without a fight. The federal authorities were freezing their son, but the local banks were preparing to freeze them. The illusion of their superiority was stripped away, leaving nothing but raw, grasping fear. People who are drowning do not ask politely for a life preserver. They claw, they thrash, and they try to drag anyone standing on the shoreline into the water with them. The next time my phone rang, it would not be a demand for legal fees. The scope of their tragedy was expanding. The true financial collapse was gathering momentum, and it was heading straight for their front door. They were going to realize that the only person left with a functioning checkbook and a roof over her head was the daughter they had so proudly discarded. The storm was far from over. It was just changing direction. January settled over Kansas with a brutal, unyielding freeze. The holidays had passed, taking the last remnants of the false spring with them. The sky remained a flat iron gray, matching the mood of the city. The aviation plant resumed full operations, the familiar roar of the assembly floor welcoming me back into the rhythm of logic and precision. My routine returned to normal. I audited manifests, approved shipments, and enjoyed the quiet, reliable structure of my life. The digital and social fallout from the federal raid had faded from the front pages, but the legal reality was just beginning to take root. The Securities and Exchange Commission had formally indicted Travis on multiple counts of wire fraud and grand larceny. The local news occasionally aired brief updates showing footage of my brother entering the federal courthouse, stripped of his tailored blazers, looking pale and small. Paige had filed for divorce, her prominent family initiating a massive legal campaign to separate her assets from his sinking ship. I watched it all unfold from a safe distance, insulated by the boundaries I had built. My phone had been quiet for weeks. I assumed the blockade was working. But desperate people do not respect boundaries. They simply look for a detour. It was a Tuesday evening, a week into the new year. I was standing in my small kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner when my phone vibrated on the counter. The caller identification displayed an unknown local number. I hesitated, the knife hovering over the cutting board. I usually ignored unknown numbers, but my role at the aviation plant occasionally required emergency vendor calls. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered. Leslie. The single word was enough. It was Martin. My father rarely spoke on the phone. Diane was the communicator, the orchestrator, the voice of the family. Martin preferred to stand in the background, offering quiet nods of approval and writing the checks. Hearing his voice, stripped of its usual confident boom, sent a brief spike of adrenaline through my veins. "How did you get this number to ring through?" I asked, keeping my tone guarded and cold. "I bought a prepaid phone from the pharmacy," he replied, his voice raspy and defeated. "Your mother is inconsolable, Leslie. She cannot get out of bed. The attorneys will not return our calls anymore. Everything is falling apart." I picked up the knife and resumed chopping, focusing on the rhythmic sound of the blade hitting the wood. "I am not wiring you $50,000, Dad. I already had this conversation with Mom on Christmas Eve. I am not calling about the legal fees." He said, his breathing shallow, the sound of a man drowning in slow motion. "The bank is taking the house, Leslie." I paused, the knife resting against a half-sliced carrot. The suburban townhouse. The house where I grew up. The house where Diane hosted her country club luncheons and curated her flawless aesthetic. The house where they had planned to ambush me with an $850,000 commercial loan application. "The feds froze his accounts," I said, keeping the emotion entirely out of my voice. "They do not seize primary residences unless you used the property as collateral." "We did," he admitted, the shame finally bleeding into his words. He let out a long, heavy sigh, the sound of a man forced to confess his ultimate failure. 3 years ago, when Travis needed seed money to launch Apex, the traditional lenders turned him down. They said his business model lacked tangible assets. Your mother was terrified he would miss his window. She believed in his vision. So we took out a second mortgage on the house. We borrowed against the equity to give him the initial capital. The revelation hung in the quiet kitchen. They had not just bought him a luxury truck or financed a downtown loft. They had literally wagered the roof over their heads on his phantom empire. They had gambled their retirement, their security, and their curated suburban life on a man who rented combine harvesters by the hour. And now the bank was calling the loan. "The federal freeze triggered a default clause," Martin continued, his voice trembling slightly. "The bank realized the collateral was tied to a fraudulent enterprise. They accelerated the debt. We received the notice of intent to foreclose this morning. We have 30 days to satisfy the outstanding balance, or they are putting the house up for public auction." I stared out the kitchen window, watching the streetlights flicker on against the gathering dark. 30 days. The timeline was brutal, an inescapable deadline rapidly approaching. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though the answer was already forming in my mind. "Because we need a bridge, Leslie," he said, the old familiar sense of entitlement creeping back into his tone despite the desperation. "We need a secondary guarantor to assume the mortgage temporarily until we can liquidate some of our other assets. We need someone with an unblemished credit profile and a steady corporate income to step in and restructure the debt with the bank." The sheer audacity of the request was staggering. Less than a month ago, they had conspired to trick me into signing a commercial loan to fund a Ponzi scheme. When Travis prevented the ambush to save himself, Diane demanded I empty my life savings for legal fees. Now, with the federal government dismantling their son and the bank preparing to evict them, Martin was asking me to legally assume the mortgage on their failing suburban fortress. They were not asking for help. They were looking for a human shield. Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a low, uncompromising register. Do you realize what you are asking me to do? You want me to strap myself to the deck of the Titanic while the bow is already underwater. It is your childhood home, Leslie, he pleaded, his voice cracking. It is where you grew up. You cannot just stand by and watch the bank auction it off to a stranger. We are your family. We made a terrible mistake, but we are asking for your help to save the foundation of this family. The foundation of this family is a lie, I replied, enunciating every word clearly to ensure there was zero ambiguity. I set the knife down and leaned against the granite counter. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, allowing the reality of my statement to settle over the line. You did not make a mistake, Dad, I continued, my voice steady, feeling a profound sense of detachment from his panic. You made an investment. You looked at the son who had failed at every single venture he ever attempted, and you looked at the daughter who worked overnight shifts to pay her own tuition. You chose to invest your equity, your pride, and your future into his illusion. You bought into the phantom because it looked better than the reality. Leslie, please, he begged, the desperation peaking. We will lose everything. We will have nowhere to go. You chose the investment, I said quietly. Now you have to live with the returns. I did not wait for a response. I did not give him the opportunity to argue, to plead, or to deploy any further guilt. I pulled the phone away from my ear, tapped the red button, and ended the call. I immediately blocked the unknown number, securing the perimeter once again. I stood in my quiet kitchen, the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the apartment. The physical distance between my home and their suburban neighborhood was only 20 miles, but the emotional distance was unbridgeable. They were entering a world defined by eviction notices, packing boxes, and public humiliation. I was remaining in a world defined by logistics, stability, and the quiet satisfaction of a clean break. The irony was absolute. The very pragmatism they had despised, the cautious nature they had labeled an embarrassment, was the exact reason I was standing in a warm apartment while they faced the winter cold. They had treated me like a disposable burden, an inconvenient reality that ruined their curated aesthetic. Now reality was the only thing left, and they had absolutely no idea how to survive it. I picked up the knife and resumed chopping the vegetables. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the collateral damage was still spreading. The federal authorities were preparing their indictment. The bank was preparing the foreclosure. My parents were facing total ruin. And Travis, the architect of the entire disaster, was out on bail, isolated and increasingly desperate. His wife had defected. His parents were bankrupt. His empire was seized. The golden boy had lost every single shield he had ever possessed. A man accustomed to dominance does not accept absolute defeat quietly. He had avoided me out of fear, but fear eventually curdles into rage when a person is stripped of all options. The storm had devastated the suburbs, but the architect of the destruction was still moving. The final confrontation was inevitable, and it was not going to happen over a phone line. The final weeks of January brought a bitter, punishing cold to the Kansas plains. The sky remained a bruised purple throughout the late afternoon, heavy with freezing moisture that coated every surface in a thick layer of frost. The aviation plant operated at full capacity, the rhythmic thud of the hydraulic presses vibrating through the concrete foundation. Inside the administrative wing, the climate was regulated and predictable. Outside, the environment was lethal. I finished my shift just after 6 in the evening. The parking lot was a sprawling expanse of black asphalt illuminated by towering sodium lights that cast an eerie orange glow over the rows of vehicles. The wind whipped across the open space, carrying tiny shards of ice that stung my cheeks. I zipped my heavy wool coat to my chin, pulled my leather gloves tight, and walked toward my designated parking space. As I approached my car, a shadow detached itself from the side of a nearby concrete pillar. The figure stepped into the orange light, blocking my path to the driver's side door. I stopped walking. My heart maintained a steady, measured rhythm. For 32 years, this silhouette had demanded my submission, my resources, and my silence. But the man standing in front of me tonight was a fractured shell of the golden boy I grew up with. It was Travis. He looked hollow. The tailored blazers and designer watches were gone, replaced by a dark, wrinkled jacket pulled tight across his chest. He had lost weight. His cheekbones protruded sharply, and dark, exhausted circles shadowed his eyes. He had posted bail pending his federal trial, securing his temporary freedom, but the toll of the indictment was written all over his face. The illusion of the visionary entrepreneur had evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, cornered animal. "I need to talk to you," he said. His voice was rough, scraping against the freezing air. "You need to step away from my car," I replied, keeping my posture rigid. I did not reach for my keys. I kept my hands visible, my tone devoid of any familial warmth.
"I am not leaving until you listen,"
he insisted, taking a half step forward. The movement was designed to intimidate, utilizing the physical proximity he had always used to dominate our childhood arguments. He expected me to shrink. He expected the pragmatic, invisible sister to lower her gaze and yield to his demands. I did not move a single inch. "The bank is taking the house from Mom and Dad," he said, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Paige took everything else and ran back to her rich father. The public defender they assigned me is drowning in paperwork. They have nothing to bargain with. The prosecutors are offering a plea deal, but it requires a staggering restitution payment to the victims. If I do not present a lump sum of cash to the court by Friday, they are revoking my bail and placing me in federal custody until the trial." He leaned closer, his eyes darting frantically across the empty parking lot. "You have a corporate retirement account," he continued, the entitlement bleeding through his desperation. "You have a robust 401k. You have stock options from this plant. You live in a cheap apartment and you never spend your money. I know you have the capital, Leslie. You need to liquidate your portfolio and write a cashier check to my legal team tomorrow morning." I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his demand hang in the freezing wind. He had spent years draining the life savings of honest farmers. He had allowed our parents to mortgage their only shelter to fund his phantom empire. He had attempted to trap me into an $850,000 commercial loan. Now, standing in the ruins of his own creation, he expected me to burn my future to keep him warm. "I owe you my retirement," I asked, my voice carrying the chill of the Kansas winter. "You owe this family," he snapped, his jaw tightening. "You sat in the background, judging me while I took risks. I tried to build something substantial. I hit a rough patch, and everyone abandoned me. You have the resources to fix this. If you do not liquidate those accounts, you are sending your own brother to a federal penitentiary." The heavy steel door of the administrative building swung open 100 yards away. A tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped out onto the frozen pavement. It was Garrett, my supervisor. He paused under the awning, his sharp eyes scanning the lot. He spotted us immediately. He registered the tense posture, the blocked car door, and the defensive distance between us. Garrett did not call out, but he altered his path, walking slowly and deliberately in our direction. Travis glanced over his shoulder, a flash of genuine panic crossing his face. He could not afford an altercation. A police report would violate his bail conditions instantly. I raised my right hand, catching Garrett's attention. I gave him a subtle, dismissive wave. I did not need a rescue. I had navigated the turbulent waters of this family for 3 decades, and I was going to finish this confrontation on my own terms. Garrett stopped walking, leaning against a light pole, remaining a silent, watchful sentinel. Travis turned his attention back to me, trying to regain his footing. "Tell your boss to mind his business." "My boss already knows exactly who you are," I said, keeping my gaze locked on his eyes. I unzipped the main compartment of my leather work bag. Travis flinched backward, his hands rising defensively, perhaps anticipating a weapon or a canister of pepper spray. I reached past my laptop and pulled out a thick, folded manila envelope. The paper felt stiff in the freezing temperature. I unfolded the document and extended my arm, holding the printed sheets out under the harsh orange light. Travis hesitated, his eyes flicking between my face and the paper. He reached out and took the pages. It was the commercial registry audit I had generated from my secure terminal weeks ago. The search results displaying Apex Horizon Energy. The stark, empty columns proving his company held 0 assets, 0 leases, and 0 legitimate operations. "Look at the timestamp in the top right corner," I instructed, my voice cutting through the wind. He squinted, reading the small black text. The date printed on the paper was mid-December. It was days before the local news broadcast aired their investigation. It was before the federal raid. It was before the panic set in. "You knew," he whispered, the color draining from his face. "I ran a vendor compliance check on your phantom company while you were busy posting photographs of rented combine harvesters." I explained, delivering the words with clinical precision. "I saw the empty shell. I knew you were running a fraud long before the journalists figured it out." His hands trembled, the edges of the paper shaking in the cold. "If you knew, why did you not say anything? Why did you not warn Mom and Dad?" "Because you told them I was an embarrassment," I replied, the truth landing with undeniable weight. "You told them to keep me away from the holiday dinner. You convinced them I lacked vision when in reality, you were terrified of my pragmatism. You pushed me out of the picture because you knew I would spot the rot in the floorboards. You isolated me to protect your scam, and in doing so, you isolated yourself from the only person who could have stopped you before the feds kicked your door down." Travis stared at the audit report, his breathing shallow and rapid. The realization was breaking him. The sister he had discarded was the one holding his fate all along. "But that is not the only reason I brought this paperwork." I continued, stepping 1 inch closer, claiming the space he had tried to dominate. "I know about Great Plains Synergy. I know you submitted fraudulent freight invoices to this aviation plant, attempting to infiltrate a global defense contractor to steal a few $1,000s. His head snapped up, his eyes wide, with a new distinct flavor of terror. "You tried to drag my employer into your scheme," I said, my tone hardening into an unbreakable boundary. "The federal prosecutors currently hold the charges for your agricultural theft. But if they find out you attempted to defraud a federal aviation supplier, they will not offer you a plea deal. They will bury you under the prison." I reached out and plucked the audit report from his shaking hands. I folded the paper carefully and slid it back into my work bag. "This document, along with the rejected invoices and the digital tracking data, sits in a locked safe inside that building," I told him. If you ever show up in this parking lot again, I hand the file to the prosecutors. If you ever call my phone, I hand them the file. If you ever send Martin or Diane to harass me for bailout money, I hand them the file. I stood tall, feeling the freezing wind rush past my shoulders. You made your choices, Travis. You built the Phantom. You stole the money. You let our parents wager their home on a lie. You are going to face the consequences alone. Now step away from my car. Travis did not argue. He did not attempt to negotiate. The hollow bravado evaporated entirely, leaving nothing but a ruined, defeated man. He stepped backward, his boots sliding slightly on the icy asphalt. He turned away, shrinking into his dark jacket, and walked toward the edge of the parking lot, where the shadows swallowed the orange light. I watched him go, feeling the last remnants of the childhood dynamic shatter into dust. The golden boy was gone. The threat was neutralized. I unlocked my door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the space, I offered a brief nod to Garrett, who pushed off the light pole and walked back into the warmth of the facility. The drive home was quiet, the frozen streets empty under the night sky. The confrontation had required every ounce of my resolve, but the return on that investment was permanent. Travis was removed from the board. Paige was gone. The focus narrowed to the final, lingering tragedy. The bank was coming for the suburban townhouse, and my parents were sitting alone in the dark, waiting for the eviction notice. The illusion was dead, and the reality was about to claim its final prize. The morning after the parking lot confrontation dawned clear and sharp the Kansas sun, reflecting blindingly off the frozen fields surrounding the aviation plant. I arrived at my desk early, the quiet hum of the administrative wing offering its usual reliable comfort. The adrenaline of facing Travis had faded, replaced by a profound, settling calm. I had drawn the final boundary and defended it successfully. The threat of my brother extracting my resources or threatening my career was permanently dismantled. But a boundary only protects what is inside it. It does not stop the destruction happening outside the walls. 2 weeks passed, pushing the calendar deep into February. The federal legal machine moved with slow, crushing inevitability. The news cycle had largely moved on from the initial shock of the Apex Horizon energy scandal, but the financial reverberations were hitting their peak. I was sitting in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon, pouring a cup of dark roast coffee, when I overheard two logistics coordinators discussing a local real estate listing. "Did you see the auction block this morning?" one of them asked, swiping through her phone. "That massive colonial out in the west suburbs just went up for a foreclosure sale. The bank is trying to offload it fast." The other coordinator leaned in, inspecting the screen. "That is the Rogers property," she said, her voice dropping a fraction as she glanced toward my table. "The parents of that guy who ran the agricultural scam." I kept my gaze fixed on my coffee cup, my expression carefully neutral. I did not need to see the screen to know exactly what house they were discussing. It was the suburban townhouse, the stage where Diane had curated her flawless aesthetic, the fortress where Martin had handed Travis the keys to his first luxury truck. The bank had finally executed the foreclosure, accelerating the debt tied to the fraudulent green energy empire. The coordinators moved on to a different topic, oblivious to the fact that the final act of my family's tragedy was currently being advertised as a distressed asset. I returned to my desk, the reality of the situation settling over me. The 30-day window my father had mentioned during his frantic burner phone call had expired. They had failed to secure a bailout. They had failed to restructure the debt. The bank had taken possession of the property, effectively evicting them from the very foundation of their curated identity. The irony of the foreclosure was already profound, but the universe possesses an incredible capacity for poetic justice. Later that evening, I sat in my apartment scrolling through the public county foreclosure registry out of sheer curiosity. I navigated to the commercial and residential auction results for the week. I found the listing for the suburban townhouse. The property had sold at a significant discount, typical for a bank looking to quickly liquidate a tainted asset. But my eyes caught on the name of the purchaser. The property had not been acquired by a faceless real estate holding company or a suburban flipper looking to renovate the kitchen. The buyer was listed as an agricultural cooperative based out of a rural farming community 2 counties over. I recognized the name of the cooperative immediately. It was the exact same farming collective that had been featured in the initial investigative news broadcast on Christmas Eve. It was the group of retired mechanics, elderly farmers, and hardworking families who had been devastated by Travis's Ponzi scheme. The mechanics of the transaction became astonishingly clear. The federal prosecutors had frozen Travis's assets, but the process of returning those funds to the victims was incredibly slow and complex. Meanwhile, the bank had repossessed my parents' home, eager to recoup the massive second mortgage they had issued. The agricultural cooperative, pooling their remaining resources, had successfully bid on the distressed property at a fraction of its market value. They were going to turn around and sell the suburban townhouse at full market price. The profit generated from the sale of my parents' curated fortress was going to directly reimburse the very people my brother had defrauded. The symmetry of the outcome was breathtaking. Diane and Martin had wagered their shelter to fund an illusion. Travis had used that funding to steal from the farmers. Now the farmers owned the shelter, and they were going to use it to rebuild the lives Travis had destroyed. The debt was being settled, not through apologies or familial bailouts, but through the cold, undeniable logic of the free market. I closed the registry tab, leaning back in my chair. The final knot in the tangled web of my family's deception had unraveled. The house of cards had not just collapsed. It had been swept up and repurposed by the people it had harmed. The following morning, I arrived at the aviation plant with a sense of clarity I had never experienced before. I walked directly past my cubicle and headed toward the Human Resources Department. I requested a physical copy of my employee profile, specifically the emergency contact and beneficiary designations. The forms listed Martin and Diane Rogers as my primary contacts, a default setting I had established years ago when I first accepted the logistics position. I picked up a black pen and drew a single, definitive line through both of their names. I left the fields blank, signed the bottom of the page, and handed the document back to the representative. I was officially unlisted. I existed solely on my own terms, tethered to no one who viewed my stability as a resource to be exploited. I returned to the administrative wing, feeling remarkably light. As I settled into my chair, Garrett approached my desk. He did not carry a red folder this time. He held a sealed corporate envelope, his expression serious, but relaxed. "The quarterly reviews are finalized," he said, placing the envelope on my keyboard. "We are restructuring the procurement division. The board recognized your efficiency identifying fraudulent vendors during the holiday shutdown. They appreciate a logistics manager who prioritizes the integrity of the supply chain over personal convenience." He tapped the envelope with his index finger. "We are moving you up to Senior Director of Regional Procurement," he announced. "The position comes with a substantial salary increase, dedicated office space, and full authority over the vendor vetting process. You earned it, Leslie." I looked at the envelope, the crisp corporate logo embossed on the corner. For 32 years, my family had told me my pragmatism was an embarrassment. They had told me I lacked vision, that my insistence on verifiable facts and logical structure was exhausting. They had pushed me away because I refused to applaud a phantom. Now, that very same pragmatism was being recognized as my greatest asset. The logic that had saved me from federal prison was currently elevating my career. "Thank you, Garrett," I said, my voice steady and confident. "I accept the position." He nodded, offering a rare, genuine smile. I will have maintenance prepare your new office by the end of the week." He walked away, leaving me alone at my desk. I opened the envelope, reviewing the official promotion details. The numbers were substantial, a tangible reflection of my value and my hard work. I folded the letter and placed it carefully into my bag. I looked out the large window overlooking the Kansas plains. The bitter winter was still holding the city in its grip, but the deep freeze felt different today. It no longer felt isolating or threatening. It felt clean. It felt like a solid foundation ready to support whatever I chose to build next. The illusion was dead. The golden boy was facing justice. The enablers were facing reality. And the pragmatic, invisible daughter was finally sitting exactly where she belonged, entirely unburdened and ready to work. April arrived in Kansas, not with a sudden shift, but with a slow, deliberate exhale. The heavy gray skies that had pinned the city of Wichita down for months finally fractured, allowing the pale winter light to turn rich and golden. The bitter frost surrendered to warm southern currents sweeping across the Great Plains. I drove my car along the rural highways just outside the city limits, keeping the windows rolled down for the first time in nearly half a year. I watched the dormant landscape wake up. The endless stretches of frozen dirt were now painted in a vibrant, breathing green as the winter wheat breached the surface. Along the wooden fence lines, the very first stalks of wild sunflowers were pushing upward, preparing to bloom under the open sky. The state was regenerating, washing away the dead layers of a brutal season. I felt a profound kinship with the changing horizon. I steered the vehicle back toward the aviation plant, navigating the familiar route with a relaxed grip on the steering wheel. My new office sat on the third floor of the administrative wing. The door featured a brushed steel nameplate bearing my title, Senior Director of Regional Procurement. Inside the space was wide and bright, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the primary assembly hangars. The promotion had required long hours and relentless focus during the first quarter of the year, but the labor felt different now. I was no longer working to distract myself from a looming familial disaster. I was building my own legacy, cementing my reputation in an industry that valued truth, precision, and reliable returns. The legal machinery surrounding my brother continued to grind forward in the background of my life, a distant storm that no longer posed a threat to my shelter. The federal prosecutors had entered the discovery phase of his trial. The sheer volume of evidence against him was staggering. Every fake invoice, every shell corporation, and every stolen wire transfer was laid bare in the public record. The judge had formally denied his request for a secondary bail hearing after uncovering his attempt to secure a fraudulent commercial loan using my identity. He remained in a federal holding facility, stripped of his tailored suits and his visionary title, waiting for a trial date that promised a harsh, uncompromising sentence. The local news still mentioned his name occasionally, but the shock value had faded. He was just another fallen grifter in a long line of broken schemes. My parents had vanished from the suburban social scene entirely. Without the sprawling townhouse, without their curated aesthetic, and without the golden boy to boast about, they had nothing left to project. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that they were renting a cramped, obscure apartment on the far edge of town, living strictly on fixed retirement benefits. The agricultural cooperative had successfully renovated and sold their former home, using the profits to restore the life savings of the farmers Travis had defrauded. Diane and Martin had spent decades worshipping an illusion, and the universe had balanced the ledger by forcing them to live in the stark, unpolished reality they had always despised. They had not attempted to contact me since the night my father called from the burner phone. The boundary I established remained unbroken. For 32 years, the quiet in my life felt like a punishment. When I brought home excellent grades, the response was a detached nod. When I secured my first corporate management role, The celebration was non-existent. I used to view that silence as a glaring deficit, a constant reminder that I was the background character in the grand performance of my brother's life. I believed that if I just worked harder, if I solved enough logistical problems, if I made myself indispensable, they would eventually invite me into the warmth of their approval. The afternoon Diane called to exclude me from the Christmas dinner was the peak of that agony, but surviving the winter taught me a deep, sustaining lesson about the nature of quiet. The silence in my apartment today is not an exile. It is an expensive, hard-won peace. The quiet is the absence of manipulation. It is the absence of midnight emergencies, fabricated corporate audits, and desperate demands for $50,000 bailouts. I no longer check my phone with a knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. I no longer wonder what catastrophe I will be expected to finance. I bought this tranquility by standing my ground, recognizing my own worth, and allowing their toxic theater to shatter. I found a new definition of loyalty within the walls of the aviation plant. Garrett and my colleagues demonstrated more genuine care and protection during my darkest week than my blood relatives had offered in 3 decades. They judged me by my actions, respected my boundaries, and rewarded my dedication. They taught me that family is not a biological mandate. Family is a network of mutual respect. It is the people who stand watch in the freezing parking lot to ensure you walk away safely. If you are listening to this and you recognize the painful echo of your own life in my story, I need you to understand one crucial truth. You cannot save people who only view you as a resource. You cannot pour your energy, your financial stability, and your emotional health into a vessel that possesses a deliberate hole at the bottom. Blood is a biological reality, but loyalty must be earned through reciprocal care. When a family treats your pragmatism as a burden while spending your sacrifices to elevate a golden child, they are not asking for your love. They are demanding your compliance. They want you to serve as the invisible scaffolding holding up their fragile egos while accepting zero credit for the architecture. Do not set yourself on fire to keep their illusions warm. When they tell you that your presence is an embarrassment, believe them. Do not argue. Do not try to prove your value to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Take that rejection, fold it into a bulletproof shield, and walk away. The world outside their curated stage is vast. It is rooted in verifiable reality, and it is filled with people who will value your strength instead of exploiting it. The journey away from the people who raised you is terrifying, and the initial silence will feel like a void. But I promise you, that void will eventually fill with the beautiful, resonant sound of your own freedom. I parked my car in the reserved executive space outside the administrative wing. The afternoon sun caught the silver facade of the aviation plant gleaming bright against the blue Kansas sky. I walked through the double doors, offered a warm greeting to the security guard, and took the elevator to my floor. I stepped into my office, placed my leather bag on the credenza, and walked over to my broad mahogany desk. I ran my hand along the polished wood. It was a table I had built entirely on my own, secured through late nights, sharp instincts, and a relentless refusal to surrender my identity. I did not have to wait for an invitation to sit here. I did not have to pretend to applaud a phantom to keep my seat. I poured a cup of dark coffee, opened the first logistics file of the afternoon, and smiled as the roar of the factory floor echoed faintly through the glass. I was finally sitting at the head of my own table, proudly alone and perfectly at peace. The traditional American family is often painted in broad, idyllic, and flawless strokes. From a young age, we are sold a highly curated vision of the American dream. Thanksgiving tables groaning under the weight of a roasted turkey, pristine suburban lawns bordered by white picket fences, and softly lit living rooms where generations gather to share stories as the winter snow falls outside. It is a beautiful image, deeply embedded in our cultural DNA, representing safety, warmth, and unconditional support. Yet, beneath the glossy veneer of these curated holiday cards and perfectly framed portraits, a quieter, more insidious reality often festers. When we reflect on the narratives of children pushed to the margins, those who are treated not as cherished members of a household, but as pragmatic resources, financial guarantors, or invisible safety nets, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about parenting values, family responsibility, and the long-term guidance we offer the next generation. The illusion of unconditional love is perhaps the most dangerous myth we perpetuate in modern society. We are taught that blood is an unbreakable bond, a sacred covenant that demands our absolute loyalty and endless forgiveness, regardless of the emotional cost. But what happens when that covenant is fundamentally transactional? What happens when a family prioritizes the aesthetic of success over the basic necessity of emotional awareness, honesty, and fairness? In many traditional family structures, a silent, devastating hierarchy takes root early on. There is frequently a golden child, the chosen vessel into which parents pour their unfulfilled ambitions, their financial resources, and their endless, blinding leniency. This child is celebrated not for their genuine character, their work ethic, or their moral compass, but for their ability to project an image of prosperity and charm that flatters the parents. The mother and father become architects of a grand illusion, funding phantom empires, leasing luxury vehicles, and excusing massive moral failures because the golden child reflects their own desperate desire for societal status. Conversely, there is the reliable child, the pragmatic, fiercely independent force who requires no financial bailouts, who pays their own tuition by working night shifts, and who navigates the brutal complexities of adulthood with quiet, uncelebrated competence. In a just and rational world, this child would be the anchor of the family, revered for their resilience and deep-seated character. Instead, in homes entirely lacking in emotional awareness, this child becomes a threat. Their honesty is labeled as cynicism. Their boundaries are framed as selfishness. Their logistical brilliance is deemed an embarrassment. They are fully expected to absorb the emotional and financial deficits of the favored sibling, acting as the invisible scaffolding that keeps the family's house of cards from collapsing. This dynamic represents a profound and catastrophic failure of parenting. Raising children in a healthy American culture should never be a zero-sum game where one child's curated fraudulent success is bought with the other child's emotional neglect and financial exploitation. True family responsibility requires a foundation built on absolute honesty and unyielding fairness, not on the fragile, temporary scaffolding of suburban appearances. When we guide children through life, the most critical, enduring lesson we can impart is that their worth is inherent, not conditional upon their utility or their ability to make the family look wealthy to the neighbors. Parents who lack deep emotional awareness often view their children merely as extensions of their own egos. They cannot distinguish between what is genuinely good for the child and what simply looks impressive to the local country club. This critical blind spot leads to devastating long-term consequences. When a parent values the illusion of a perfect family over the messy, beautiful reality of authentic connection, they teach their children that love is a commodity to be traded. The golden child learns that they are above the rules, leading to a life of hollow entitlement, reckless entitlement, and eventual ruin. The invisible child learns that they must constantly earn their keep through endless sacrifice, leading to a lifetime of quiet, suffocating resentment. To break this toxic cycle, we must fundamentally redefine what traditional family values actually mean. It is not about maintaining a flawless facade. True traditional values are rooted in fierce accountability. They require parents to look their children in the eye and offer absolute fairness, to celebrate quiet hard work over unearned loud charm, and to cultivate an environment where honesty is rewarded, even when it is deeply uncomfortable. We are culturally conditioned to believe that family is our ultimate sanctuary. We are instructed by society, religion, and media to forgive, to forget, and to keep the peace at all costs. But when the peace is maintained solely by the silent suffering and financial exploitation of the most responsible member, it is not peace at all. It is an emotional hostage situation. The narratives of the overlooked children, where daughters are uninvited from holidays to protect a scam expected to cover exorbitant forged debts, or asked to sacrifice their own survival for a sibling's crimes, highlight a profound distortion of what family responsibility should be. It is a sobering, terrifying realization that sometimes the people who brought you into the world are the ones most willing to throw you overboard just to keep their own sinking ship afloat for a few more days. Navigating this ultimate betrayal requires an immense pioneering strength. It demands that the overlooked child finally stops waiting for an invitation to a table where they were only ever meant to serve the food. It requires them to build a new table, constructed from the hard-won timber of their own self-respect, and to sit there proudly, even if they must sit there alone. These stories of fractured families, transactional love, and the quiet, monumental strength it takes to finally walk away are not isolated incidents. They are reflections of a much broader, silent cultural struggle happening behind closed doors everywhere. If these themes resonate with the unspoken chapters of your own life, if you have ever felt like the invisible anchor holding up someone else's fragile illusion, know that you are not alone in the quiet. Follow Intimately Told Stories for more narratives that explore the raw, unfiltered realities of human connection, the beauty of resilience, and the incredible courage it takes to rewrite your own ending. Ultimately, to truly heal, we must confront a difficult philosophical reality that fundamentally challenges everything we have been taught about the sanctity of the traditional family. We are instructed from birth that forgiveness is the highest moral virtue, and that walking away from your own blood is the ultimate failure of character. But this conventional wisdom is a trap designed to keep the victim in the room with their abusers. The most profound act of moral courage, and perhaps the most honest expression of familial responsibility, is the willingness to let the illusion die. True justice in a family does not always look like tearful reconciliation, heartfelt apologies, or forced holiday dinners. Sometimes the highest form of justice looks like a clean, silent, and permanent break. You cannot heal a sickness by remaining in the room where the poison is poured. And you cannot save people who view your destruction as a necessary cost for their survival. Peace, in its purest and most expensive form, is not the absence of conflict within your family. It is the absolute, unshakable certainty that you no longer need them to see your worth in order to know that it exists. Look at the empty chair at your table tonight and ask yourself a question that might change your life. Are you mourning the person who should be sitting there? Or are you finally breathing the air they used to steal?